for Family is the best, worst adult cartoon I've ever seen. I'm aware those are two very conflicting adjectives, but it really is the best way I can describe my feelings towards this show, because it does so much stuff I don't like. In any other case, I would absolutely loathe F is for Family. But somehow, I think it's one of the greatest and most underappreciated adult sitcoms I've ever watched. Just how is that? Well, we got a bit of time to go over it, haven't we? F is for Family released back at the end of 2015, and very recently at the end of 2021 aired its 5th and final season on Netflix. And for the longest time, I did not want to give this series a chance. I mean, just look at it. I think most had the initial impression that this was just going to be your standard run-of-the-mill Family Guy clone that comes out and is forgotten about in like a week. But I watched through the whole thing when the 4th season was out and kinda fell in love with it. I thought it was amazing. I know, I like stuff sometimes, it's crazy. But they somehow created a show that was miserable and depressing and uncomfortable, and I love it. Maybe that says more about me than anything. One of the biggest red flags I had when going in was that it was created by Bill Burr. Now, I have nothing against the guy. I don't think I've seen a single thing he's in other than Breaking Bad and the awful Heach 3 podcast interview. But there seems to be a trend where a comedian comes along, wants to make an adult cartoon, craps out the worst thing imaginable, probably under the assumption that making an animated cartoon was easy, and screws off onto the next project after it's cancelled in 4 episodes. We've got junk like Alan Gregory created by Jonah Hill, where he basically just took Stewie Griffin, tried to make him more of a smarmy intellectual, and called it a day, being dropped only 7 episodes in. Or on the other side of the spectrum, we've got something like Big Mouth by Nick Kroll, which undoubtedly is beloved by a large group of people and has been an immense success for Netflix. However, it certainly doesn't have the best reputation online. F is for Family, on the other hand, kinda just came and went without much fanfare, receiving generally positive reviews across the board, however, never once managed to reach the same level of popularity as its peers. Why is that? Again, to reiterate, upon watching it, under what appears to be your average lowbrow Family Guy knockoff, became what is without a doubt one of my favorite shows out there, showing a harshly realistic view on an average American family in the 70s, particularly with the stigma around masculinity and the effects that can have on one's mental health, especially during a time period where expressing that was extremely taboo. But even further than that, you can tell this was a project incredibly near and dear to Bill Burr, him having a part in much more than just the creation of it, writing many of the best episodes up until the finale, having help from plenty of acclaimed folks along the way, such as writers from The Simpsons' golden era. Although, spiting all that positivity, however, F is for Family is also one of the ugliest, most unfunny cartoons I think I've ever seen, doing a lot of stuff that I really don't care for and would make me hate any other show for doing the exact same thing. But I think it's certainly a case where I can understand why it's there, and the good definitely outweighs the bad. So without further ado, let's get right into F is for Family season by season, just to truly see what makes it the best worst adult cartoon ever. F is for Family stars Frank Murphy. On the outside, he's your average man in the 70s, works a pretty standard job at the airport, coming back every night to his stay-at-home wife Sue, eldest teen son Kevin, adolescent Bill, and his youngest kid Maureen. Guess which one is meant to be Bill Burr? The first scene perfectly encapsulates what the whole show is about. It's after work and the family are all sitting at the dinner table trying to enjoy their supper together, Frank trying to keep up this perfect, happy family image, almost for himself in a way, while the phone keeps ringing over and over again, not letting him be in this perfect world without the constant looming of life and responsibilities keeping him in check. His rage building up more and more to the point where he screams at the kid on the phone and leaves to punch a boxing bag in his garage, yelling at another kid in the process. From just this, you know exactly what kind of guy Frank Murphy is. He's someone who cares deeply about the family he's built, but never truly gets to enjoy that because of the lack of control he really has over his own life. He knows he's a slave to the 9-to-5 system and there's nothing he can do to get out of it, having given up his own dreams to start a family because that's what he was expected to do as a man. The intro encapsulates this wonderfully, like the actual intro with the theme song and everything, showing a young and optimistic Frank graduating college and soaring high into the sky, but reality sets in. He's drafted, gets his wife pregnant, gets fat and bald, and quickly plummets to the ground where he remains dormant in a chair surrounded by his family. It perfectly shows how fast everything can move and how overwhelming it is having everything pile on at once, him barely being able to get by. It's a great reflection of the series as a whole because, oh boy, is this shit depressing. Each season has the Murphy family members all going through their own little arcs, building around one theme, but the first season goes for something much more broad with all of them, which I think was a smart move on the writer's part. It's not really one of those shows where you can watch one episode and get what exactly it is they're going for, so if you were ever interested in checking it out, I'd recommend watching all of season 1 before gathering a solid opinion. Helps that by far it's the shortest season at only 6 episodes. But because of this, it gives you the most basic overview of these characters and what you can expect from them. They have a pretty clear trend. Life sucks. Let's start with Maureen because she's without a doubt the least interesting member of the Murphy family and not one I care to focus on too much. She's the youngest in the family and doesn't really go through much development in the first season, and I gotta say she's the only one of them who I actively dislike. Ironically, I talked about it in my previous video, but I've never really been a fan of the bratty little girl stereotype who's just annoying to the other characters, and we're meant to gawk and awe because it's cute or whatever. It's not that bad with her. It's done more realistically than many other examples I could name, but on her own she doesn't really have much going on. She's mainly just used as a foil for other characters such as Bill, who's much more interesting thankfully, clearly being the stand-in for a young Bill Burr, although it's not made too obvious. You know, unlike Big Mouth that doesn't come off like one big vent piece, they build onto this idea that Bill is kind of a pushover. He gets bullied at school, his only friend is the one neighborhood kid less cool than him, and he's constantly undermined by his father, wanting his respect. The theme with Bill is a loss of innocence, which I always enjoy, but because the entire show doesn't revolve around him, it doesn't lean all that much into it being a coming-of-age story, which I usually love, but here I don't mind, because each member of the family represents a different age group and therefore all get their own time to shine. Bill is just meant to be their excuse to tell stories with an adolescent boy. There are these great moments I love where Bill's childlike view of the world is broken again and again, followed by prolonged sequences of him looking distraught, like when he catches his brother j***ing off or winds up in his parents' room while they're frickin', even hearing his own dad insult him behind his back. You know what this reminds me of? The scene from Rick and Morty, where Morty has just had his entire perception of the world shaken, and now has changed because of that, although F is for Family does it in a much more natural way. Throughout the series, Bill and Morty go through very similar character shifts, starting as a bit of a pussy, and because of events surrounding them, become more hard and cynical over time. However, with Bill, it's many events piling onto each other, and the change isn't immediate. Rick and Morty had the issue where because Morty had this shift so early into the series, we've now been stuck with a version of him so drastically different than his original personality, to the point of feeling like an entirely different character. And not helping is that the show is looking to go on for many, many more years, so the version of him in season 1 is going to seem so bizarre compared to how he acts for the rest of the series. Okay, that issue is going to be made a lot worse pretty soon. However, with Bill, not only does it work that F is for Family is a limited run, meaning they only had to work with him for 5 seasons and not indefinitely, but as we're going to see, they also do something different with him every time. He's not just cynical and that's that. They use it to tell stories that revolve around that change, with season 1 ending on him pushing his luck and winds up burning down the whole neighborhood forest. There's a payoff that feels natural to what they're building up to. I like Bill a lot, but he's nowhere near my favorite Murphy. Sadly, neither is Kevin, the eldest. Now, I don't not like him, but in season 1 he really doesn't have that much to do. But as we go on, you'll see they start to focus on him more and more and actually give him stuff to do which improves him a bunch. But here he's just used as a lightning rod for most of Frank's anger, as he's quite literally the exact opposite of what Frank looks for in his son, being a slacker kid with no real aspirations other than becoming a successful musician, something Frank deems worthless so that he's just wasting his time. Sue and Frank are where things start to get interesting for me, as they're easily one of the most realistic depictions of a married couple I've ever seen in a cartoon. The trope here is nothing new. The aggravated working man who just wants to enjoy his peace and quiet when he's home from work, but can't do to his righty kids and nagging wife. But right off the bat throughout season 1, they make it apparent that there is so much more to them than that. Starting with Sue, that is all she's presented as initially. The stay-at-home mom who has a part-time job selling plastic Tupperware, which like Kevin, is constantly undermined by Frank.
So, while mommy's busy with the little hobby...
It's a job!
Yes, fine, a job.
Throughout the first episode, it's treated as your fairly standard sitcom setup. But during the second episode, after she's finished all of her wifely duties for the day, you get this. She's miserable. Her life has no real purpose and she's aware of it. She wants to achieve something greater but knows that her responsibilities as a mother don't allow her to do that. She's expected to just be the stay-at-home housewife. The series greatly plays with these tropes. In any other standard adult sitcom, these would be all the characters are. It would be where every source of conflict arises from. But in F is for Family, we see them actively try to change the roles they've been given, Sue eventually getting a full-time job later in the season. The prime example of this, though, can be seen with our protagonist, Frank Murphy. He's deceptively simple at the beginning. You think he's just gonna be the angry dad stand-in. Every episode will be about something making him angry, and it'll be funny. But it's not. It's really sad. If there's one thing I can certainly compliment the show on, it's that the arguments are so genuine and real to the point of being uncomfortable at times. Frank and Sue are constantly at each other's throats, screaming at each other, calling each other all the names under the sun, but even then, they tend to end on some kind of positive note, whether it be them realizing that no matter what, they'll always love each other and will be in each other's corners, or feeling bad for what happened and eventually trying to make it better. It's a depressing series to watch, but that doesn't come from the characters being assholes to each other, like I could say about so many other shows like Family Guy. It's depressing because you can see the actual human struggle in it. All these characters who want different things that clash with each other. And you're seeing them realize just how many hurdles they have to jump through just to be content with their lives. You soon realize that Frank isn't just your stuffy workaholic dad archetype. He's a miserable man who is not happy with his life. Near the end of the season, we get a brief glimpse at something that will be explored in later seasons. Having Frank talk to his son about how when he was younger he was going to be a pilot, even getting accepted into school, but had to give up on it upon getting his girlfriend pregnant. It's treated fairly inconsequentially here, but you soon realize that this is where the source of a lot of his anger comes from. Frank dropped everything in his life to do what he felt he was expected to do, marry the girl he got pregnant and get a job to support his newfound family, naively thinking he could just put his goals on the back burner to pick them back up at a later point. But that's not how life works. No matter what, there's always something bringing him further and further away from the dream he was so close to achieving. And Frank spends so much time lamenting about that he can't appreciate what's in front of him. There's a great moment in the first season where Frank has to take care of the kids while Sue is out doing her work for the day, which he clearly cannot handle because to him, that's not his job. He works at the airport 5 to 6 times a week, and so childcare should be the woman's job. He then gets a call from his wife's boss offering her a full-time job, something she evidently wants and is pushing for. And without even telling her that she got the offer, he declines it, hoping she'd never even find out. He does these actions and makes choices that usually would make you despise any other character, but because it's made so clear how deceptively complicated his life is and how much his ideology runs on the stereotypical nuclear family, you can understand why he does this. He just wants things to go back to his version of normal. And of course he ends up paying the price when Sue finds out and abandons them, him having to apologize and her letting him know that's not good enough. That for once he actually needs to back up his words with actions. He can't just say he supports her trying to do something for herself, he has to mean it now too. Frank is a super complex character that can be summed up by the simple point that he hates change. He was raised believing the world to be a certain way, and so any deviation from that scares him. Again, the first season does an excellent job in giving you the most basic understanding of their dynamics. And as we'll soon see, each and every one of them will be built upon and explored deeper as the series goes on. I'm really glad upon watching it that the show does give so much focus onto Frank, given Bill clearly being the stand-in for Bill Burr when he was a kid. You'd expect him to be the star, but because the star is his dad, it adds a lot of new meaning to everything. Like at first we get to see all these scenes of Frank being furious and bombastic, like a short fuse always ready to burst. Probably how Bill Burr saw his actual father when he was a kid. But it's like the show is a reflection of Bill realizing that as he got older, there were a lot more understandable reasons for his dad being that way. Like it's him making a show dedicated to sympathizing for his father and realizing all the hardships he actually had to go through that Bill just never knew about. Bill Burr also hits it out of the park when it comes to voicing him. You can definitely tell he was recounting exact inflections from his dad when yelling as him. And the rest of them do a good job too, such as Justin Long as Kevin, aka Alvin from Alvin and the Chipmunks. And I also noticed that not only Debbie Derryberry, the voice of Jimmy Neutron, plays Maureen, but also like 90% of the side characters. Speaking of, they try really hard to introduce you to this world. Like they wanted their own mini Springfield here, where secondary characters can come in and out of the plot when they please to give their recurring jokes. Or consistent TV series they're always watching. Them doing that thing like The Simpsons or Family Guy where there's extended scenes of us watching the show they're watching, so they can comment on TV of the time. And personally, I didn't really give a shit about any of this stuff. There's not a single side character here I like other than his Ned Flanders, Vic, although that's probably just because he's voiced by Sam Rockwell. But they all mostly boil down to the same gags over and over again, and I think they try a little too hard at times to make you like them. Like if they shove them and their repeated jokes in your face long enough, you'll start to laugh too. Laugh I never did! Yeah, F is for Family is without a doubt one of the least consistently funny shows I've ever watched. And I'm not just talking about how many of the jokes are simply racism or misogyny. Honestly, I don't mind those too much because there's at least some sort of deeper meaning with them, given how they're used to comment on how different the times were back then. But it's a lot of gross out stuff and cursing, and I think I've just grown out of that kind of stuff over the years. But yeah, no, I watched this show for the family drama, not for its amazing humor or anything. What doesn't help is the visuals. The series looks terrible. The designs for most of the characters are good, even if some of the kids look a little weird. But the rigs definitely don't do it any favors, making everything look super rigid and slow. It ruins a lot of the pacing and jokes because the voice actors give such exaggerated performances, yet their faces a lot of the time don't reflect the delivery at all. There are very occasional times where they try to shake things up, like this moment where they replicated the old UPS style, which I enjoy a lot, but those are very few and far between. If you can get past how it looks, under the surface there's a really special series here that has so much potential with these characters, and with season 1 ending on such a depressing note, it leaves you in anticipation for what's to come. There's a big strike going on at the airport throughout season 1, Frank being stuck between helping his friends and helping his boss, and the finale gives another example of how this show tries to be much more realistic than so many other cartoons, not falling into the same happy endings. With Frank driving down to the airport on Christmas Eve and giving a big sappy speech on the news, bringing the two parties together. The CEO of the company finally coming to an agreement with the union and putting a stop to the strike. Everything ends on a perfect little sappy note, until Frank is then fired immediately after. I love this as it shows you'll never get that with the series. You'll never get that moment where things are peaceful and stress-free. You get rid of one problem and two more arise. So let's see what this loss brings to the family in season 2. Where season 1 sets up these characters, how they act, and what their wants are, season 2 actively delves into that, showing how trying to achieve these goals is a lot harder than it initially seemed, because of their pre-established roles in the family. This is reflected with the opening, which shows a flashback to when things still seemed like they were looking up in Frank's life. He just got back from fighting in the war and is considered a hero and training to become a pilot, before cutting to where he's at now. 3 weeks unemployed with his wife now pulling all the weight. Much of the season is focused on Frank having lost his job, which I think is really smart. It shows that, in a way, his job was an intrinsic part of him because he's a man. To him, having no job and not being able to provide for his family means that he may as well have been dead. This is never something he actively expresses to his wife, however, instead bottling his aggression up, which makes him further lash out at his family. He isn't being irrational either. People do treat him differently now that he doesn't have a job. He knows that people are talking about him behind his back, and when they do speak to him, they treat him like a lost puppy or like he's on suicide watch, which certainly doesn't help. This leads to some really sad, uncomfortable moments, where he's being such an asshole but you can't help but sympathize for him because it comes from pure desperation. Like there's this great part where he takes his family out to dinner and has a nice meal with them, before realizing that at this point he can't even afford to pay the bill. And instead of taking the handout that the waitress is offering him, he takes that as an insult and starts yelling at her in front of everyone. I love how headstrong his character is. He has such strong beliefs about the world and how it should work. His pride is so huge that he would never allow anyone to support his family other than him. No handouts no matter how much they really need it. But of course in his pursuit of that, it causes a cavalcade of other conflicts, mainly with his kids. Sue gets on Frank's ass about going to the unemployment office, as they're getting to their wits' end. With him dragging his feet through the mud, he does eventually wind up going, but backs out at the last second, because he doesn't want to see himself on the same level as everybody else there. He doesn't want to feel like he's leeching off his government. Around the same time, he has an interaction with Kevin, who's ditching school, where he tells his son that he has to be honest with his mom about it, that a real man never lies. And so despite Kevin being truthful and admitting that he skipped class, clearly taking what his dad said to heart, Frank immediately buckles under the idea of being demeaned by his wife and lies to her, saying that he was at the unemployment office all day, putting on such a show about it that it demands an apology from her. Discussing all this makes me shocked how they somehow didn't make Frank completely unlikable. And in those cases, I think the simple animation ends up working in its favor. It's not one of those moments where he lies and then is let off the hook and so now he's all happy and stuff. He gets what he wants, but throughout it all, has this basic sad look on his face, staring at his son as he now knows that he just lost all of his respect. That if a real man doesn't lie, then what does that make him? There's a similar thing going on with Bill, where Frank has become so preoccupied with all the other stuff going on in his life that he starts to neglect him, forgetting to take him to hockey practice, which was the one thing he was looking forward to. Even doing something his dad was proud of and getting a job to pay for the stick, showing that Frank is always willing to offer words of support when they're doing something he likes, but rarely ever backs it up by continuing to show an interest. One thing I love in season 2 is how everything constantly feeds into each other. It's not just, character acts this way because other characters said this. It's showing you how much of a hierarchy there truly is when it comes to these things. That there's always a reason for somebody doing something. Bill isn't just acting out because. It's from not getting enough attention at home from his mom and dad. But that too isn't just cause. It's because Sue is going through her own issues at the minute, facing massive hardships at work with her employers being incredibly misogynistic towards her, belittling all her input, and Frank is so preoccupied dealing with the depression from losing his job and dealing with Kevin, but also from the new job he gets where he's paid much less and therefore has to work way more hours to make up for it, often being sleep deprived. No character just is. There's a reason for everything, and because of that, it helps you understand where they're coming from more when they take certain actions. The real meat of Season 2, however, is the marriage between Frank and Sue, and how because of everything piling on like this, it's seeming to be on its last legs. Sue ends up getting a job at the plasterwork company to Frank's dismay, as it now means he has to stay at home and take care of the kids. But she immediately wants to quit because of how awful it is dealing with the customers. She realizes she was in over her head, and a job wasn't the answer to all of her problems like she thought it was.
You really think I could quit it?
Wait, you want to quit?
I know I wanted a job, but Frank, it's horrible.
However, because Frank ruins his chance of getting his job back at the airport, she has to get the job working up at corporate for a bunch of men who sexually harass and discriminate against her. Frank sees and realizes none of this because of their severe lack of communication, and only sees that she has a job and he doesn't, building up his own resentments, this time towards his wife. She has a spark of hope when she makes this big invention for the company, giving her some new outlet and purpose, which of course upsets Frank, as now he has to deal with her taking her time away from the family again, which reaches a breaking point where she has to spend some money on a prototype build, and realizes that Frank stole all the money she was saving up for a rainy day to get back some stock that was ruined on his shift. And so when she finds out about this, she sells a locket that he gave her years ago to pay for it. It's like symbolism or something, no freaking way. After they blow up at each other, he devises a plan to get rid of his replacement at the airport, and gleefully explains to Sue how all their problems are going to be over. Now that he's getting his job back, she can quit hers, and everything can go back to normal. He has such a simple way of viewing the situation at hand, not understanding how fundamental their marital issues are. And after she blows him off to focus on her work for a change, he realizes how unsupportive he's really been towards her. How much he's deviated from his younger self who was always ready and willing to. And so he agrees to go to the church's couple retreat with her. This is where we get probably my favorite moment of the season, possibly one of the best moments of the whole show. The culmination of all this pent-up rage. During this retreat, Sue constantly chastises Frank for never letting his guard down and being honest about what's bothering him, obviously thinking that only when he does that will he be able to work through their issues. She just wants to understand him, and so keeps pushing him until he lets out this speech.
I lost my job, and how did you support me?
I got a job to feed the whole goddamn family!
Yeah, a job where you're doing better than me!
At this point, the floodgates are open and everything comes out. He explains why it hurt him so much not being the person providing, that if he's not doing that, then he's worthless.
So when I got fired, I lost 2 jobs. Mohican and being head of our house.
Well, what am I?
And that's why, I guess deep down, in a roundabout way, I was hoping that you'd fail.
This is what she wanted all along, for him to be honest and communicate about what's been eating at him. And so how does she react?
In the book of Job.
You motherfucker!
Ow!
She screams at him for saying something so awful. She wanted him to talk so badly that she never stopped to consider that what he's thinking could be so bad. It would be so easy for them to present either one as the bad guy. Frank for having such terrible feelings towards his wife, or Sue for suddenly being mad at him for doing exactly what she wanted all along. But the great thing about this show is that they rarely present anyone as objectively in the wrong. It's all on the viewer to understand both sides. They devote just as much time to Sue's journey as they do Frank's. It isn't just a case of Sue feeling betrayed at Frank for saying what he says, because, again, they've been building to this all season. You think she'd be happy when he's open, but at the same time, of course she's pissed, who wouldn't be? It helps that we've seen her at her job. We see how much she's belittled and undermined by her peers, so to find out that not even her own husband supports her and wants to see her screw up is horrible. You understand completely where she's coming from, but at the same time, you kinda see why Frank feels the way he does. He's put so much of his value into his work that when he doesn't have a job, he worries that he's not needed anymore. Again, they show you how he gave up everything for his family. The one goal he had in life was to be a pilot, and he made the sacrifice of abandoning that for the sake of raising a kid and getting a job to support them. So that job really was all he had going for him. It's solved in a pretty outlandish way with Frank having a big standoff at the airport, where it's hijacked and he winds up being shot and gives yet another big speech on the news, this time about his wife and how much of an ass he's been the whole time for not supporting her.
The only right decision I ever made was marrying that woman. And I spent the last 2 months throwing it all away.
But given how miserable her marriage has been all season, I don't mind the bit of levity. This is one of those shows where if you're in a bad mood, you should not watch it if you're looking to get your mind off how you're feeling. There is always something bad going on to somebody here. It's always building. But I like that more realistic portrayal of life. It's very similar to BoJack Horseman in that sense, another Netflix cartoon. Although instead of having a focus on mental health, it's about the structure of your average nuclear family and the roles they fill. You can also see there was a slight increase in budget after the first season, or maybe the animators were just getting more used to working with these characters. There are still a couple of moments where it gets a little more creative, and I appreciate those despite how few and far between they are. This season was also thankfully a little funnier too, or maybe the increased episode count to 10 just meant there was more opportunity for me to laugh. But I think my issue with the humor is that they're doing the same jokes you've heard again and again. And sometimes it works, but it's only if the voice acting backs it up. Like, Kevin is probably the funniest character on the show to me other than Frank, but it is 100% down to Justin Long's performance.
Get out, you f***ing freak!
Will you tell everybody we fucked?
I've heard that joke a million times, but the way he says it makes it work. The comedy wouldn't be such a problem, but they commit to it hard. It does that thing where jokes constantly build on each other, where it segues into something else or can pan over to another group of side characters for a gag, which then immediately leads into a new joke about something else. And while this isn't a big deal in a series like The Simpsons, which has a similar way of formatting its comedy, I don't think it works as well in F is for Family because of how focused everything else is. Like, these neighbor characters do nothing other than Vic. But even then, his storyline is tied to Kevin's while playing music. But the rest are just meant to be dressing, to remind you that there are indeed other people living in this world other than the Murphy family. But they're not all that memorable and rely on the same jokes. Like his fat boss is fat and eats a lot. Groundbreaking stuff. Or his Peter Griffin neighbor is a creep and nobody ever acknowledges it. That doesn't get old. And them being voiced by the same 3 or 4 secondary actors does not help.
How could you? He didn't eat off him! Yes, you did!
Ah, Christ.
Come on, that's just Jimmy Neutron. Still though, Season 2 is an incredibly strong one. Takes everything great about the first and further expands upon it to give you more insight on Frank and Sue's relationship, with some nice breaks showing how their behavior ends up influencing their kids too. Speaking of kids though, we see Frank and Sue end by talking about how now that the kids are getting older, they can finally start getting back to the lives they put in the back burner. Sure would be a shame if anything were to get in the way of that. Oh, God damn it! Season 3 of F is for Family is really about family. And I think it might be my favorite out of all of them, all because of one man, and his name is Vince Vaughn. It's summertime, but don't you worry. The nice change of scenery doesn't mean things are going to be any less miserable. Right off the bat, we see a wholesome family moment ruined under Sue's realization that she's quit everything she's ever started in life, and this baby is just another roadblock. She feels that her time is running out, and there's nothing she can do to prevent it no matter how hard she tries. Women. Am I right, fellas? This leads her to pursuing a new invention after her previous one was stolen by the company's CEO and became a massive success. But, in her pursuit to find meaning in her life with this new one, she fails to realize that the idea is crap and nobody likes it. The invention is a representation for her last ounce of hope that she can finally do something greater with her life. And she fails. Welp. We also get to meet her parents for the first time, which was cool. You get to see how much they hate Frank and blame him for ruining their daughter's life. Everyone in the show is a piece of shit. It's wonderful. They do a lot more with Bill this season, giving him a new love interest. That being his bully's little sister, Bridget. Can you guess who she's voiced by? That's right, Jimmy Neutron. I hate her, she's a bitch, and it only seems to make Bill want her more. That's her only character trait, and she also speaks like a gallon of spit is trying to escape her mouth at all times. It's awful. I don't know why these writers are so incapable of writing for little girls. Okay, yeah, no, that explains it. Kevin also has a bit more to do as well. Him wanting to express his sad feelings more, and because of this, his friends no longer want to be around him, kicking him out of his band. And as a result, he starts hanging out with some older kids he met during his summer school. One of which is just Badger from Breaking Bad. Like literally Badger, same voice, same actor, everything. What is it with all these Breaking Bad connections? Yet again, though, it's Frank who steals the show here. We've seen how he is with his work in Season 1, we've explored his relationship with his wife in Season 2, and now in Season 3, we see him build off a character who's a reflection of himself in a way, befriending a guy who, in Frank's mind, got to live the life he had to leave behind. We're introduced to the new neighbor on the block, Chet, with his wife Win-Win. Chet is a well-respected Air Force pilot. It's like the thing that Frank wanted to be. And because of this, Frank deeply admires him. It gets to the point of being romantic at times. And why wouldn't you like him? He's such a stand-up guy.
Want to take a spin?
If I didn't go to hell for loving a man, I'd kiss you.
He's super kind, helping Frank with all his problems. His wife gives him advice. Hell, he even offers to build an extension onto their house for the new baby. How swell! Frank has spent so much time being miserable about the world around him that it's really sweet seeing him make a genuine friend who shares an interest with him, even getting to the point of being jealous when he starts to bond with their other neighbors. The relationship definitely begins to get to an unhealthy area, however. By episode 3, we see by the end that Frank is so sick and tired of dealing with how unpredictable Sue's mood will be with her pregnancy and all, that he'd rather go to Chet's house immediately after work than his own. It's clear it goes a lot deeper than that too. At the end of the second episode, he helps Frank by giving this big speech about his friend, that he's seen some shit in war, and because of this has completely hardened, but deep down has a lot of issues that are never brought to light. You think this is just for the sake of getting him the pizza like he wanted, but way later in the season we see the exact scenario he described play out but with him instead of Frank, where he's sitting alone at night outside as a cat walks up on the fence in his garden and he sheds a single tear. He's a broken man. You really start to sympathize for the guy. But before getting to that point completely, things start to shift. Over time, Frank begins to get small red flags. Like when they're visiting one of the Air Force places to get wood for the extension, he starts hitting on women despite being with Win-Win, even mentioning Frank being able to get one too. And when he obviously declines this, trying to get Chet to admit it's only a joke, it becomes super awkward.
You know, Sandy has a roommate. Not great looking, but a hell of a moaner.
Kidding, right? I would never do that to Sue.
So I guess I'm a bad guy, huh?
There's also this moment in episode 5 where the characters are all watching a sporting event where it seems like a woman is about to beat a man. And there's so much going on that you might miss it, because not only is Frank desperately seeking Chet's approval among their friends, but Sue is also internalizing the game as a reason for her to keep going with her invention no matter what. But during it, Chet's wife makes a playful jab against him, with him giving her this quick stern look. This later pays off when Sue is returning some food over to the house and overhears him screaming at her for belittling him in front of his peers, heavily implying that this is a common thing. Initially, I was wondering why in a show so obsessed with gross out and extreme topics that they don't shy away from, that they wouldn't go to the limits with this. As you go on, you realize how intentional of a decision this was. Domestic abuse is, for some reason, a pretty common topic in adult animation. The infamous Family Guy episode comes to mind. However, where both of these differ is how the characters react to it, and what we're shown as a viewer. In Screams of Silence, it is exaggerated to the nth degree. She's always got bruises and is timid, slouching around him. They introduce her by having the other characters acknowledge this is a common thing they're all aware of, and nobody seems to really care that much. So when they do try to tackle it seriously, it's laughable. They try to have their cake and eat it too. They want a serious drama and a funny comedy about Peter Griffin. But in F is for Family, it's all about what they don't show. The following episode sees Sue having told Frank about this, and him still trying to give Chet the benefit of the doubt. He doesn't even want to imagine him doing something like this, because Chet in his mind represents the person he wants to be. This would obviously be a lot harder for Frank to defend if he was actually caught hitting her. But because all she witnessed was verbal abuse, he's willing to look past it. I mean, why wouldn't he? He screams at his family all the time. This is then further exemplified later in the day, when Frank actually does witness him physically assault someone out of anger. He still tries to act nice towards him, but makes it clear that he's looking down upon him in this instance. This is where everything shifts. When the family get back from their summer vacation, they see that Chet has built the entire extension by himself. See, what a swell guy. We can just look past that whole abusing his wife thing now, can't we? Well, turns out that immediately after finishing the thing, Chet called up the city council and told them about the Murphys' new unauthorized extension on their house. Meaning Frank is now being tasked with tearing the whole thing down, and for every day he doesn't do it, he's charged the modern day equivalent of $250. Look, I could forgive the whole hitting his wife thing, but this is going too far. You know, at this point, Frank's rose-tilted glasses are off, and he sees Chet for what he really is, vindictive and calculating, even turning all their neighbors against the Murphy family at one point. And even worse, the dickhead just got a job at the same airline as Frank. This really is building up to be the most interesting dynamic on the show. Yeah, not exactly a fan of how abrupt this is. Turns out his wife had been slowly poisoning him over time as revenge for the abuse, and so now he's out of the show. Welp. It really does feel like there was so much untapped potential of this character that had yet to be explored. But because they were reaching the 10 episode limit and usually like keeping each season relatively self-contained, they write him out. It's not all bad. We do have one final moment of Frank and him in the hospital which I enjoy a lot, showing how much of a lost cause the guy truly was. He lets Frank in for a bit and talks about his childhood and the awful stuff he had to endure, then becoming a part of something infinitely more worse once being drafted, talking about how it all made it impossible for him to care about anything. Even in his last moments, he couldn't handle being genuine and sincere for a minute. But for just that one short moment, he let Frank in. They then end the season on some big action scene with Bill trying to run away and then almost dying from electrocution, but I didn't really care for that stuff as much. Because the stuff with the kids is more often than not a reflection of how they're being treated by their parents, I end up finding the parents infinitely more interesting to talk about. Like the scene between Kevin and Frank where he finally talks about his own father and how horribly abusive he was, showing you why Frank is the way he is. That because it's how he was raised, it's the only way he knows how to treat his own kid. It's cyclical. But by the finale, Frank and Sue apologize to the kids for not spending enough time with them. That they got so carried away with pursuing their own dreams that they forgot they're a family. Aww. And so with that, things seem to finally be going back to normal for the Murphy family.
Evidently, your grandfather is gonna be staying with us.
The hell he is!
I seriously do love how each season of this show gives Frank someone primarily for him to work off of, which highlights a different aspect of who he is as a person. This time it's his father and unboxing that traumatic past. His dad's come to town, being the first time Frank has seen him in around 18 years or so.
They lost my bag. My meal tasted like an ashtray. No matter what you do, kids, never fly Mohican.
Recognize that voice anywhere? Yep, that's right. It's Mike from Better Call Saul.
Put your dick away, Walter.
Frank is naturally very pissed off about this, but not for the reason you might think. It's not because of how awful his dad is, it's in fact because he seems completely different now. He's nice. This eats away at him. He's waiting for that moment where the act is broken, and everybody can finally see him for how Frank did as a kid. You know, an asshole. They do a great job at showing how his dad acts to the public versus behind closed doors, being a very respected figure in the town and then taking out all his rage on his family. And in Frank's pursuit of trying to get him to drop the act, he realizes that everything he's mad at his father for doing is the exact same way he acts towards his own kids. Upon rewatching this season, I was shocked to remember that we barely get to see Frank interact with his dad, despite that being the whole focus. Instead, it's mainly to show how, in his attempt to receive some kind of apology, he's ignoring his own family. But you can understand his frustrations because he has nobody he can talk to about this. Everybody thinks Frank is the asshole for the way he treats his father, because they only got to see him for how he was to the public. Things aren't going well for the other family members either. Well, other than Bill, he's content. Ironically enough, because he's completely given up on having any kind of morality, and is a straight-up asshole to everyone.
I told you not to come, and then you made a big deal about it, and you still didn't come. It was better when you weren't pretending to try.
Maureen also befriends Bridget after a while, realizing they have a lot in common. They try to make you sympathize for her by giving her a sad, dead mother backstory, but do nothing else to make you like her. She's still a massive bitch. Once again, I think Maureen is definitely the weakest aspect of the show. They do next to nothing with her. Same with Kevin this season. He gets a girlfriend, which is sweet, but it's mainly paired up with the Vic arc yet again, where he realizes he's getting older and there's not much he can do to fight it, placing all of his hopes onto Kevin's career, which obviously fails. It's no surprise that yet again Frank and Sue are the stars of the show, one of the best moments with her coming from this season. She gets a call from her old boss asking to meet her at a restaurant. She's ecstatic at first, as she thinks she's going to be offered her old job back, but then realizes it was merely to have a baby shower, which depresses her. This is the moment where you can see she's given up. She finally understands that there's not much else she can do with her life, or at least not follow the exact dream she wanted, and outwardly expresses how much she doesn't want to have her baby. Fun times. As the season continues, however, we see that the standout character is none other than Bill. Not that Bill, but like Frank's dad's name is also Bill, so... My name is Walter Hartwell. Little Bill starts hanging around Big Bill more, almost seeing him as his parental figure. But when put back in the exact same element of keeping up a solid public image, his grandfather winds up slipping back into the same attitude he had towards Frank, this time towards his grandson. And he does it in front of everybody too. It's super awkward. He fucking threatens to hit him.
It was an accident!
It was an accident letting you out of the house without a leash. Pick him up before I put you down that fucking well.
This is when Bill realizes that maybe he did treat Frank poorly when he was a kid, and at that point they're able to somewhat bond, even if it isn't Little Wes. He gives his son the most minor words of encouragement, but it's evident that it means the world to him.
I always thought it was a good hook.
Really?
Yeah, one of the best I've seen. Fluid, natural motion.
And even jokingly gives Frank the first bit of physical bonding he's received from the fella. This then immediately carries over to showing Frank hugging all of his children. He knows how much that meant to him, and because of that, realizes how important it is for him to do the same for his kids. Frank's childhood trauma has vanished and everything is right with the world. Except of course not. If you were expecting a happy ending, then you're sorely mistaken. If you want that, then go back to watching frickin' Peppa Pig or Bluey, you absolute baby. Sue doesn't accept this. Similarly to season 2, she's been begging for Frank to forgive his father this entire time, and when he finally does, she can't understand it, and tries to put Frank in his place, telling him that one hug doesn't fix decades of neglect and torment, and that he's simply using that to cope and find an easy way out of it. That nothing was actually solved here between the two of them, which Frank obviously scoffs at the idea of.
Deep down inside, I guess I just needed an attaboy.
I've been telling you that for 6 weeks.
It seems pretty unreasonable at first, again because this is what she wanted. But the more she explains, the more you start to understand her side, that she's put at the brunt of his rage all the time, and so when he eventually realizes that he isn't as fixed as he thought he was, it's going to be an even worse blowout than usual, and she's going to have to be the person to pick up the pieces. And so understandably, she wants her husband to keep his expectations in check, which of course he doesn't, and ends up paying the ultimate price for. We'll later see the family watching Marine School play, where Frank tells his dad he can drop the act and admit how shitty he was to him when he was a kid. But he still denies it, because he truly doesn't believe he did anything worth apologizing for. And with everything having built up for so long, he finally stands up to his father and strikes him in the face. Obviously, this is justice being served, but to everyone else present for this, they just saw this guy punch an elderly man in the face. They had no idea how deserved this was, and because of that, Frank is, once again, seen as the bad guy. I swear to God, he can never catch a fucking break. At this point, Frank leaves for some work retreat knowing his wife could go into labor any day now, because he can't stand to face everyone's judgments. This is only notable because the airline rival is voiced by Joe Pera, who gives a good performance. But this is where the season kinda runs out of steam in my opinion. It's the same issue as last time, where it feels like they've just hit a brick wall. They know they're at episode 10, and so they need to wrap everything up as quickly as possible. And so Sue goes into labor, Frank rushes back to be there for the delivery, almost getting involved in an action-packed plane crash. But most importantly, Bill comes to realize how badly he messed up with his son, that he really wasn't the great father he thought of himself as. To him, the role of a man is to put food on the table. And so in his eyes, he did exactly what he was meant to do. Sound familiar?
I raised him the best I knew for the times. Was I perfect? No.
That's why Frank is the way he is, because the only person he could look up to showed him no love, and that's the example he tried to lead to his own kids. I'm not personally a massive fan of how quickly Bill has this turnaround. We go from him wanting to bash Frank's head in, to that scene I just showed you not coming long after. So, for such a headstrong character, it would have made sense for us to, see his turnaround. But that's a minor nitpick in the grand scheme of things. Bill finally, after all these years, apologizes to his son, promising to be better. But there'll be time for that later, he's got a birth to witness. So yeah, the baby is born, hallelujah. Everything is right with the world, bam! Dead dad.
Dad? Dad! Dad!
Yes, that is how they end the season. I mean, are you really that surprised? I both love and hate this ending. Love it because it shows that Frank never truly got the closure he so desperately sought after, that he was so close to getting what he always wanted, and much like everything else in his life, it was stripped from him at the last second. Fits in line with how everything else in the universe is set on beating the man down. Dead dad? Of course, throw it in the pile. But I mostly hate it for how it was executed. It's too abrupt. And that partially is just to leave it on a cliffhanger for the next season, I'm aware, but at the same time, come on, there was no signs of him being close to death's door until this point. In my eyes, it should have been something they built up to throughout the final couple episodes. They don't need to focus on it too much or have the guy spit blood or cough or whatever, but even one hint that things weren't okay with this would help. Then, during the scene where his dad is trying to apologize, have it made clear to Frank that his father isn't doing okay, and this may be his last moments on Earth. And because of that, he has an extremely hard choice to make. Be with his dad as he passes away, or be with his family to witness his baby being born. It's like a life and death kind of thing, like a yin and the yang, you know what I'm saying? Still though, that ends what I would consider my second favorite season. There's a lot of stuff I feel to mention, like this one contains the only episode of the entire show to focus on a character other than the Murphys, with one of Frank's airport friends, Rosie, becoming the city alderman, and I'm sorry, I just don't care. Rosie is definitely up there with Vic as being one of the better secondary characters because he's actually a character. But I can't help but feel like I wished they used that for more of the stuff with Frank and his dad, because it really needed at least one more episode. Despite the rushed ending, though, Season 4 further focuses on the strengths of the series, that being exploring Frank's character using other people in his life as excuses to delve into certain aspects of his personality, this time being why he is the way he is, and I think they handled it all super well, ending aside. It does beg the question though, where can they go from here? We only have one season left, and it's the second shortest at only 8 episodes. Is this going to be a case where the show is incredibly strong throughout, only to leave us on a lackluster conclusion? Yeah, kinda. Okay, it's not that bad. I actually think the ending works perfectly for what the show has been set up as. I just can't help but feel like it was left a little open-ended in the hopes of them potentially getting a 6th season, which of course didn't happen. But I also think that works in its favor, you know, given all the themes the series has explored throughout its run. We pick up right where things have left off. Frank's dad has just passed away and we're at the funeral. But Frank is acting very differently to how he was at the end of his dad's life, seeming like he doesn't really care all that much, and just wants it to be over and done with so he can move on. Actively getting annoyed when people come up to him and talk about what a great guy his dad was. Things continue to get worse when he tries to leave his job after the company was bought out by the rival airport, but it turns out that because he was fired back in Season 1, they don't consider him an employee for his 15 years of service, only the past 6 months, which obviously is going to heavily deduct his leaving check. And right when he tries to have a more positive mood and not care about this junk, he's thrown for a loop again when he finds a key to a box that his dad had told him about before he died. And so now he's got to decide whether or not to move on from all this, or continue to search for an answer that may not even exist. He chooses the latter. Really, you get the vibe from this whole entire season that they're trying to figure out a way to give you some sort of conclusion for these characters. Sue once again meets with her parents, this time to try and reconnect their family, mainly her estranged brother Lewis, who was banished from the family for being gay. She doesn't want things to end the same way it did for Frank and his father. They end by giving her somewhat of a natural outlet to give her more purpose, opening up a baby daycare in town that trains young parents on how to handle raising a kid. In one way it's nice because it allows her to put her skills to use and feel important, but also maybe not all that great because she really is just boiled down to being able to raise kids well. That's all she can do. But still, I appreciate the effort. It's a nice ending. Given how they're nowhere near as important as Frank and Sue, it also made sense for them to compile all the kids' final arcs into a single episode as well. At this point in the series, Maureen has gone down the path of Satanism, Bill is a junior cop, and Kevin is sulking over being dumped by his girlfriend, and so their parents send all of them off for the dead to handle their issues. I love what they do with it here. Frank is told point blank that only he is responsible for how his kids are, that he has to stop looking for someone to blame. Bill even gets to explain to him how he saw them having sex back in the first season.
No! Oh, Jesus Christ! No!
And it ends with one of my favorite conclusions to any episode in the series. With them having exhausted every other option, they try the simple approach of being attentive to their kids. You know, actually being a family and doing stuff together. They realize that quality time is the key, that their kids aren't screwed up, they're just having different experiences in life, some good, some bad, and it's how they react to and deal with their children, which will shape how they turn out. He learns that instead of chasing after some cryptic message from his dad, Frank should enjoy what he still has in his life, the one thing he does have control over. Damn, it's bizarre this is only episode 6 out of 8, this is like the perfect finale to the show, what else is there?
Oh my god.
Of course. So Frank finds the box his dad was talking about and it's full of cassette tapes, and so he completely reverts, isolating himself from his family to try and find out what his dad was trying to tell him. But there's nothing. He stops keeping up the positive act, and very much so returns back to a version of himself akin to Season 1, believing the answer is in his work, that being good at his job is the key to a happy life. This leads into the finale, which honestly I think is pretty underwhelming. Frank won't get his Christmas bonus unless he comes up with a groundbreaking idea for the airport, and so wants this evil Knievel guy to jump one of their planes, and most of the final episode is spent watching that disaster unfold, along with a Rosie Alderman subplot, which, again, don't really care about. Much like everything else in his life, the plan fails. The guy makes the jump, but proceeds to call out the entire town for how self-seeking they are, especially Frank. And because of this, he gets demoted and his pay is cut in half. I mean, at least it's consistently depressing. He of course takes this out in his family, blowing up at them on Christmas, and ends up leaving to drink his sorrows away at a bar, where he's informed that there was never any meaning behind the box. He misinterpreted what his dad has been talking about, and he put himself in this miserable position for no reason, because he, yet again, put all of his self-worth into his work.
It wasn't all bad. He just didn't know how to be a dad.
How fucking hard is it to not be an asshole to your own kid?
Well, you're here drinking on Christmas, so you tell me.
This is when he finally comes to understand the ultimate message of the entire series, that he can't control his life. There's always going to be a variable he couldn't account for, but what he can control is how he reacts. Because he had a kid before he really had himself figured out, he spent their entire childhoods repeating the same patterns his own father had towards him, not understanding that his kids have now been building up the exact same kind of resentments towards him.
I found out what Box 16 means.
Really?
It means my parents were two messed up people who fucked and made me. And nothing more.
At this point, he comes home and apologizes, the ending entirely paralleling the intro to episode 1, the family all sitting at the table where Frank is interrupted by the phone ringing. But this time, he doesn't answer. He's gonna continue doing what's important to him, and that's spending time with his family.
What if they're calling from work? It might be important.
Nah, this is important.
I'm not gonna act like F is for Family is some sort of groundbreaking show, that it's one of the all-time classic cartoons that everybody has to watch. Again, a lot of it I heavily dislike, such as the animation and especially the humor, but I think there's more than enough good here. Where the show really shines is how genuinely it portrays a natural family dynamic, and how screwed up it can be, but approaches it from all angles to make you understand that nobody is a good or bad guy, they're just people trying to figure themselves out. And that's what I love about it. Its commentary or messages aren't even that deep. It's not a BoJack, where there needs to be in-depth discussions about every single episode talking about what every little line represents, and means in the grand scheme of things. But I like how simple it is. It's a nice, refreshing change of pace to see a cartoon in this day and age that just tries to be completely genuine. There's no snark, no meta commentary where the characters wink and nudge at the camera. You can tell that Bill Burr and the other writers just really wanted to tell a story about their childhoods, trying to understand why their parents were the way they were. And I think that's really special. It sucks that, despite all the positive reviews, many people weren't able to look past the art style and give it a chance. And I get it, a cartoon's appearance is such a large factor. It's the first thing you see. But F is for Family is definitely one of those rare cases, where I hope some of you are able to look past the bad, and see that what's really here is a genuinely amazing show, and one which I hope was able to garner more attention over time. You ever find a show that you hear the premise of and think, that sounds great, I'd love to watch that, and then at every opportunity to sit down and view it you think, nah, this isn't the right time. I really want to enjoy this and take it all in, and for whatever reason, I don't think I'm gonna get everything I can out of it right now. And then that continues for days and days until you forget about it altogether. That was me with Tear Across the Dotted Line, and by God do I regret having waited 2 years to sit through it all. I mean, I really don't know why I stuck my feet in the mud so much, it's only like an hour and a half long. I saw a few people talking about this when it released, but nothing massive. I personally watched the first episode, didn't think much of it, got annoyed by the main character's voice, and never really watched it again. Until a couple months back when I finally decided to give it the time of day, and I loved it. I thought it was really something special and unique, which is astonishing because it could have been so terrible so easily. Tear Across the Dotted Line is an Italian cartoon produced by Netflix. In 2021 it got released with an English dub, where all the characters are now British. Perfect. It's actually an adaptation of a popular graphic novel series over there, created by Zero Calcare, which follows the main character Zero as he deals with his problems alongside his anthropomorphic armadillo friend who pretty much just acts as his conscience, criticizing and picking apart everything he does. Oh yeah, nobody else can see the armadillo, I probably should have mentioned that. It can be real though if you just watch the Italian live-action movie adaptation. Oh my god. Not that it matters much since about 95% of the show is solely focused on Zero and the armadillo. They make it evident from the get-go that this is his journey, nobody else's. Sure, he's got his small group of friends palling around, but you're gonna pick up on something pretty quick with them.
I was at a gig with my friend Sarah, who said to me, "Zero, this is Alice. She's a friend of mine. You talk to her for a bit while I go get beers."
Yeah, just about every single character in this series is voiced by one person. One person who likes to talk very quickly.
Anyway, I wasn't thinking about any of that this morning. This morning I had other shit to deal with.
It was my main reason for quitting so early when it came out. It's one of those things where if you look away from it for like a second, you're suddenly like, wait, why is his mom a chicken? Just came off random for random's sake. But the more I watched it, the more I started to understand what it was going for, because it's not a conventional show by any means. And because of that, and finally going through all 6 episodes, I think it remains as a series that, even after a few years, manages to stand out among any other animated show on Netflix. And so today I wanted to go over the show in its entirety. Also its sequel series, which recently came out, but I don't have as positive an opinion on, but maybe it'll convince some of you to check it out. Because I really do think that Tear Across the Dotted Line is one of the best shows that nobody watched.
Because we thought that's the way life worked. That we just had to tear along the dotted line, very slowly, following that dotted line to our destiny.
Like I said, the series follows Zero going on a journey with his friends. We know nothing about what this journey is or where they're going, and quite frankly, it doesn't seem like the series cares much either. As for the first 4 or 5 episodes, we're left completely in the dark about what's going on. It's something you hardly realize, however, as a good chunk of every episode is dedicated to Zero recounting certain moments in his life, which can go from something as existential as him realizing as a kid that he's not the center of the universe and that nobody other than his family really care about him, to something as seemingly simple and uneventful as him trying to use social media while at the same time not letting his friend Alice see him active as he's ignoring her. They establish a lot about his friendship with Alice and how much it meant to him, but also how complicated it was with the two never really acknowledging their feelings for each other. They pretty quickly give you an idea of what themes they're going to be exploring throughout the whole thing, with Zero using the dotted line metaphor for his life, that he tried to follow it along as straight as he could, thinking he would have the time to divert off his destined path when he's older, but now he's in his late 30s and wondering how things have gotten to this point. It's also worth noting that in this story, Zero is very overtly a stand-in for the creator. They don't even attempt to hide it, with them talking about his eventual career as a cartoonist. I really like that they barely focus on that aspect, however, and instead choose to mostly tell the story through flashbacks, when he didn't have things figured out. Given his general attitude and, well, his design, you'd be right in guessing that this is a very cynical character. He's got some snide comment to make about everything and doesn't mind his friends correcting him on his cynicism, as it means he can now complain about them being right all the time. At first, this came off super annoying. Like, why would you want to sit and watch something where the main character just complains all the time? Wait, why'd you get to me? But I like it here because it's all counterbalanced with this sense of insecurity he has. You can feel as he's writing, his mind is trying to look ahead and see what people will think of him. And so he quickly acknowledges that and then moves on. You really get this feeling that any thought that came to mind was put in the script.
So I spent the evening scrolling through the titles thinking, it's not possible that all these films are shit.
You can't say all these films are shit. Second, do you really think the stuff that you make is any better? Don't be arrogant.
I'm not usually into this kind of meta-humor in TV shows. I tend to find it pretty cheap and an easy way to write dialogue. But the entire thing is built around it in a way that results in it having such a unique voice to it. If anything, it reminds me of a high-budget storytime video. We cut to the main character standing against a backdrop talking to the audience, then narrate stories in their life and do impressions of the people in those stories. Although there's a little more color than storytime videos, that's appreciated. And while at first you think all these stories are completely disparate, as the series goes on you realize how everything he's been describing, no matter how pedantic, all serves a purpose and contributes to the greater theme. That being that Zero feels he has no control over his life. That he's terrified of decision-making over what it could mean for his future. That it will divert him from the path he's on and how that scares him to his core. Every little thing, even something as simple as him deciding what to order at a pizza place when there's only 2 options, leads him down that same existential crisis, which is not only funny, but it's relatable.
I look him in the eyes, and all I can see is the pain of an evening where 400 people before me couldn't decide what to eat.
Maybe not the exact scenarios described, but we've all felt that feeling before, right? That feeling of comfortability versus fear of the unknown. The idea that when we follow along with what we always do, you're left feeling kinda empty, wondering what might have happened if we took that extra leap. But then what if you took that leap and ended up regretting your decision? It's like that saying, it's better to succeed no, that's not it. It's better to have loved and lost, but okay, never mind. That's similar, though. You know what I'm talking about? Fuck it. Okay. It's better to have tried and failed than to live life wondering what could have happened if I had tried. Mr. Beast. I'm sure we can all relate to that feeling. I know I can.
So there was a third scenario that I hadn't considered. The one where I had the same old pizza, there was no dramatic turn of events, and the world kept on turning in the same frustratingly placid way as it always has.
Here's an example of the way they build upon these seemingly inconsequential stories. In episode 3, we learned about Zero's past and being a tutor and how much he hated it. How he feels he was wasting his time with kids who didn't actually care about what he was teaching them. Also, one turned out to be a Nazi that kind of dampened it. But later on in like episode 5, he runs into one of the girls he used to tutor and is stunned to see her grown up, to see her like an actual human. And even worse than that, she's succeeding more than him. It breaks his whole view of how the world should work in his mind. He can't even comprehend how much of a failure that means he is before realizing it's all his fault. That this is a direct result of his inability to make decisions and how that's what's holding him back.
Long time, I thought that if I stopped tearing along the dotted line, I couldn't do any further damage. Except that's not how it works, because if you keep the same bit of paper in your hand for 10 years, even if you don't tear it, it'll get ruined.
They come back to this dotted line metaphor a lot, and I understand why. I don't know if this has existed before, or if the author came up with it on his own, but it really is such a versatile and simple way for him to sum up one's life. And all the different ways you can try to take the easy route, but how much that also continues to mess things up. When you can just take the leap and start tearing. But even that has struggles.
But I wasn't looking while I was tearing, because I was scared that if I looked up, I'd see that I was actually miles off the line.
That's the thing. Despite the way the main character looks and talks and the way I've been describing him, this is not a depressing show at all. If anything, it ends up having a really positive outlook on things at times. Like that part I mentioned earlier where he realizes his teachers at school don't care as much about him as he thought. It would be easy to take that with this slacker approach, like sweet, no expectations. But they instead highlight how it's rather comforting. That you're allowed to fuck up through life and nobody will really notice or care because they're so caught up in their own.
Don't you realise how great this is? That you don't need to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. That you're just a single blade of grass in a field. Don't you feel lighter?
Because of everything being presented from Zero's point of view, it results in a lot of the other characters falling to the wayside. His friends, Sarah and Seko, are more so used as examples of the different directions one's life could go, with Sarah being stuck in a dead-end, demeaning job while putting on a smile in the hope of her achieving her dreams in the future, whereas Seko sees it as just a means to an end, living off online poker just to continue living carefree. And I wasn't that into the armadillo at first, but I honestly think it's more of an issue with watching episode 1 with no real context of what's going on. It's very much one of those series where they throw you right into it with no room to breathe, so the armadillo is just here, along with this other animal guy who never appears again beyond this one line. And while I'm sure to an Italian familiar with his graphic novels this would be fine, watching as an English person unfamiliar with who or what it was just didn't give me the best first impression. I've heard a lot of others share that same sentiment too, which is too bad. If you had that happen when watching the first episode, I would definitely recommend seeing it through to the end. Again, hour and a half, it's basically a movie. One thing that certainly drew my eye was the visuals. Not the animation itself, really, it's got that kind of tweened look to it, which I know isn't for everyone. But I personally don't really mind here because it caters to the art style so well. I love the harsh black lines that when you get real up close to them are all imperfect and wobbly. Reminds me of a Flash cartoon. And the constant harsh shading was a little distracting at first, but I began to appreciate how much it helps the art style. It does so much in making shots not look flat. One thing I want to praise for sure is the storyboarding and composition. It is spectacular. There's so much variety in these shots. It makes his long-winded rants so much more entertaining when paired with the animation. Like if he's talking about the pressures of what he should say to the girl he likes, we see him walking on a tightrope, and then it zooms out and shows that it's actually just a little bar that comes up when you're texting someone. It's simple and may not sound like a lot, but when you're watching it, it does so much in keeping you engaged. Basic stuff like that goes a long way. I love how they use such literal examples of what he's talking about to elevate his point. And they even occasionally switch up the art style in interesting ways, such as when he's fixing up his car and we see this little IKEA instruction doodle kind of style. It's great. The final 2 episodes, though, are when the show really picks up for me. Not that the previous ones weren't entertaining, but more so, they make all the previous ones so much better. They reveal by the end of episode 4 that the reason he's been complaining so much, the reason he's been so in his own head about everything, is because if he isn't, then he has to think about where he's going. And after episode 5 sees him staying at an old couple's house, we finally get the reveal in the most nonchalant way ever. Spoilers, by the way.
Can't get to sleep when I'm sharing a bed with someone. Well, at least us two are in the guest room. Think about Sarah sleeping in a dead girl's bed.
As it turns out, the trip they were going on was for a funeral. Alice's funeral, staying at her parents' house just a couple weeks after she took her own life. I never mentioned it previously, but throughout the whole series, whenever Alice is talking, they put a weird robot filter over her voice. It's one of those things that when you watch episode 1, you're confused and put off by it. But now with the context, it makes so much more sense. He can't make an impression of her because he doesn't remember enough of what she sounds like to do what he thinks is an accurate version of her voice. The final episode of this series is really something special. The perfect culmination of everything they had been setting up throughout the show. Zero goes to the funeral and reflects on their time together, which makes him start to spiral as he starts wondering why she would do it, why she would want to take her own life. The blade of grass line his friend had tried to reassure him with when they were children doesn't have the same effect it once did.
We cling on to the concept of comparing our lives to other people's that seem perfectly cut out. And perhaps they're only that perfect because we see them from afar.
The thing that shocked me so much about this show is that it would have been so easy to follow that cynical theme to the end. To have the character just be that way and use it for comedy, kind of similar to Dan Versus or something akin to that. Interesting factoid, this whole video was like about this show and Dan Versus, but then I just got too into talking about this show. But they actually go further with it and expand upon all the different ways you can try to combat this feeling, but that none of the ways will actually help. It all comes back to that idea of comfortability versus fear of the unknown. He was comfortable being nothing more than Alice's friend. He was interested in taking things further, but was ultimately too afraid of what the consequences might be. He was afraid it wasn't the path he was meant to follow. And because of that, he starts internalizing every decision he's ever made, not making a move on her, not reciprocating her advances, even stuff that doesn't matter like him choosing to ignore a call that one time. He takes all of that on as his burden of responsibility, that he could have saved her. But then they don't dwell on it.
You're doing exactly what you did as a kid, acting like you have the power of life and death over those around you. Did I tell you the truth? And you're on a guilt trip because you're an egomaniac and you need to feel like the lead in a film that isn't about you.
They explain how things were so much more complicated than he can ever understand. That maybe they'll never know why she did it, but that isn't his fault. Just because his life isn't what he thought it would be doesn't mean that what he has isn't enough. That he should appreciate it for what it is instead of comparing himself to everyone else. That as long as he has hope, then that's enough. A little sappy, some might call it pretentious, but you know what? I don't really care. Because no matter what you think of this series, you can't deny that it was someone's complete, unfiltered vision. It's a piece of art, which is more than I could say about, I don't know, Big Mouth or Paradise PD or whatever else shit Netflix pumps out for quick revenue. To me, it stands as an excellent miniseries. And something that truly highlights the advantages of streaming over television, because something like this would not have been possible then. Makes me wish companies were more willing to take chances with these similar, shorter, more earnest personal stories. But even if Netflix makes nothing else like this, I'm glad something like Terra Across the Dotted Line was able to be made, because it's without a doubt one of my favorite miniseries ever. I first got into Scott Pilgrim at the age of 11 after watching a Let's Play of the video game and then proceeding to look up a 240p rip of the film on YouTube, and it blew my mind. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Everything about it, from the look to the sound, the editing, the performances, then and there, I became a fan of Scott Pilgrim and wanted to take a look through anything and everything that had come before. This is when I read through the original graphic novel series, up until the last one at least. I kinda got distracted, and really grew to appreciate them as well, despite taking me a while to get used to all the changes from the movie, which I'd seen like 20 times at that point. A good result of Scott Pilgrim being turned into a major motion picture is that with all of Universal's attempts to ensure the movie would be a financial success, I said attempts, it meant they pumped out way more content surrounding the series to generate hype and get people interested. One of these was, again, the long-presumed dead and recently revived Scott Pilgrim Xbox Live game, but also a short animation briefly summarizing Scott's previous relationship with another character in the film, with the movie's actors reprising their roles and adapting an art style extremely similar to the graphic novels. And after seeing this, it left me wondering, why is Scott Pilgrim a live-action film anyways? Created by Brian Lee O'Malley and releasing its first volume in 2004, Scott Pilgrim sees the 23-year-old drummer from Toronto, Canada, having to defeat the 7 evil exes of his dream girl Ramona Flowers, in order to be rewarded with her hand in, relationship. Just from hearing this outlandish yet obviously metaphorical setup and looking at the fun, unique art style, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who wouldn't have taken something animated over this still very good live-action outing. Now, Scott Pilgrim has had a major influence over me. I did a terrible animated short film in my art class based off the series, and some of you have been quick to point out the similarities between my YouTube avatar and the protagonist. And you'd be right to do so, as my avatar originally started as a 16-year-old me attempting to draw Scott Pilgrim from memory on my new art tablet, realizing it looked nothing like Scott Pilgrim, and so slowly fleshed it out into its own thing. I was craving more Scott Pilgrim, but wasn't sure if it would return in any other way due to the movie being a box office bomb. It was like getting on a train that had already reached its destination, becoming a fan of a series that didn't look like it was getting any more content. But if there's something I guess I could go back and tell my child self who was desperately awaiting the announcement of a project like this, I'd probably say, just be patient. Everything gets rebooted eventually.
I had a dream about that girl again.
Toronto, Canada. Not too long ago.
2023 marked the return of Scott Pilgrim after a whole 13 years, with the announcement of an 8-episode Netflix series, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, which on the surface level appeared to be a retelling of the events that transpired in the books. Scott Pilgrim, 7 Evil Exes, Girl of His Dreams, you get the drill. The art looked immaculate, and every actor from the film returned to reprise their role. My biggest issue with the movie was that condensing 6 books into 2 hours resulted in a lot of stuff remaining on the cutting room floor and the end product feeling rushed towards the conclusion. Now they have the chance to truly expand upon what was missing and create the ultimate Scott Pilgrim experience. This is everything my teenage self could have wanted. So then, why do I feel so conflicted towards it? I liked Scott Pilgrim Takes Off a lot. It was nowhere near what I and many others were expecting, and I think that more than anything has resulted in the vastly different opinions on it we've been seeing. Overall, I find myself really having to think about the decisions it's gone with, consider why Brian Lee O'Malley went in the direction he did, the purpose of him drifting so far astray in comparison to every other Scott Pilgrim adaptation, to discover if that was even a decision I personally think was made for the better. And I'd like to make it clear that this is nothing more than my subjective views towards the series, and I haven't read the books in a long time, so I'm gonna try not to speak on those too directly due to that gap in my Scott Pilgrim knowledge. But what I do aim to do here is take a look at Takes Off, why it's upset so many people, and why after thinking about it for a long time, I've actually come around to appreciate a lot of the ways in which it shows us a Scott Pilgrim we've never seen before, even if we spend most of the series away from him. Because otherwise, if I don't, then I just come out of the experience feeling like something was missing. Yeah, if you were unaware and had only seen the discourse in passing, the main source of contention towards Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is the decision to quickly subvert your expectations of what you would envision a series based off the book or movie to be by instead showing you an alternate take on the story we've seen told again and again. Here we have a world in which Scott Pilgrim is dead. Losing his fight against Ramona's first evil ex-boyfriend, we follow her as she learns more about his past through talking to the people in his life, and questioning if there were more to his passing than meets the eye. Already, you can kinda see a raised eyebrow or two. Wait a second, this is a Scott Pilgrim adaptation without Scott Pilgrim? And to that I'd say, yeah, but no, but yeah. After Scott dies at the end of episode 1, we don't see him return until all the way in episode 7. It soon after becomes clear that this isn't the same story being told in the same way. If you were looking for a more faithful adaptation of the books that the movie didn't offer you, then I'm sorry to say this isn't going to satisfy you either. If anything, it'll probably make some people resent the series, as they were so close to giving you what you wanted. But at the same time, I also think that was the point. Like, you can blame this on advertising, not making it more apparent that this is something new, but I can also see the mindset in teasing the audience with something so familiar. So much of episode 1 is in direct reference to the movie, which makes it all the more impactful when they finally pull the rug from under you, and reveals that you're in for a different ride, seeing these characters in a light never before seen. I feel like in a world where most show and movie trailers feel desperate to grab your attention and therefore spoil the whole thing, it's nice to watch a show that genuinely did surprise me. But at the same time, a surprise isn't enough. You also need to convince the viewer that your diversion is going to be in service of something greater, so that you don't make them wish they could have just had Scott Pilgrim again. I guess where I went wrong in my approach to this show was looking at it as a retelling when, really it's more of a reimagining. It's like a New Game Plus. It's the same, but different. The big difference here being the larger focus on Ramona. And by larger, I mean she's not the main character. Without Scott here to defeat them, we see the League of Evil Exes restructure, kicking out the leader Gideon Graves in favor of Matthew Patel, who until now has only ever been the Evil Ex who gets taken care of quickest. I thought it was clever to give this once almost tutorial-like character the spotlight for a change, along with Ramona being a more active player in the plot rather than simply being something to be fought for. This is undoubtedly done to address and correct a major piece of criticism towards Scott Pilgrim, being that nobody in this world has any depth whatsoever, outside of Scott Pilgrim. Now, to me, that was never a bad thing. The series always had hints of your typical coming-of-age story, showcasing Scott as an incredibly flawed protagonist who consistently steps on the hearts of those around him to follow whatever path he chooses on a whim. Getting broken up with and trying to rebound by playing with the heart of a 17-year-old high school girl, before dropping her the second the girl of his dreams skates by. Going on a journey to be with her, sure, but also on a journey of self-discovery and respect. Learning that he can't continue to ignore the people he steps on, that he isn't the lovable, snarky protagonist, and that his actions have consequences on the world around him. Everyone is so one-dimensional because it's almost like that's how Scott sees them. In the books, this growth is done through him literally manifesting all his negative traits into an evil doppelganger, before having to accept those traits as a part of him instead of something he can just fight. That acceptance is the first step towards growing. And in the movie, it's through him just kind of saying sorry, and the growth is more of an implication to happen afterwards. Not as strong, but again, that ending overall was just very rushed. However, here the focus is solely on Ramona being the one to deal with her exes. Rather than fighting them to the death, she chooses to just talk to him. Despite being a beloved franchise, Scott Pilgrim is not without its detractors, and one of the most common complaints towards the series has to do with Ramona herself. That being she's what the young ones call a manic pixie dream girl. Less of a character and more of a caricature of the perfect woman, whose only purpose is for the protagonist to fawn over and eventually win through whatever struggle is needed. And again, it's been a while since I've read the books, but at least in relation to the movie, I agree completely with this assessment. Movie Ramona always comes off kinda cold. Her relationship with Scott never feels genuine. But I think when people bring this up as a point of contention towards the film, I always have to wonder, what's the point though, right? Scott Pilgrim isn't like other coming-of-age movies such as 500 Days of Summer or Almost Famous. To me, it always seemed laser-focused on dissecting Scott as a character, with everyone else merely existing to steer him towards this realization that he needs to grow up and have some respect for those around him, and himself. And so I think most of the differences between the Scott Pilgrim reimaginings can be made evident by simply asking the question, what is the intention of Ramona? In the movie, at least, I always got the impression that they were trying to show that Ramona isn't a good choice for Scott, and that they don't mesh that well together at all. That Scott is yet again looking for someone to fill a void in his life and thinking that his answer is in this woman. Now, of course, this ending kind of muddies it, as we all know he does end up with her at the end, which seems to go against everything they had been setting up, but that's not without reason. See, there exists an entirely alternate version of the movie's ending. Basically everything after Scott dies, where he comes to realize that he's been so hellbent on fighting for Ramona that he fails to see the person who he actually had a real connection with the whole time. The 17-year-old girl, still not a perfect ending, but it does recontextualize a lot of the movie, mostly making it clear that the reason everyone comes off so shallow is because, well, they are, it's on purpose. The book wasn't finished yet by the time the movie was in production, so I always took this ending more as director Edgar Wright's version of the story. It may not be the same Scott Pilgrim ending we saw in the graphic novel, but I think it works just as well, 17-year-old girl aside. It's the complete opposite of the book's ending, which as far as I'm aware just ends with Scott and Ramona taking on a fresh start together. But because it was eventually changed to fit in line with the graphic novel's conclusion of them leaving together to try again, it causes the rest of the movie to feel slightly off. They couldn't change too much with a limited time and budget, and so the whole time you're led to believe it's going to end one way, only for it to change lanes way too late, and so Scott and Ramona's relationship leaves you feeling as if something is missing. Actual development. You have a romance movie where one guy's a lovable jackass, and the girl seems completely aloof to it all, just kind of going with it. So this ending where you're meant to believe they care about each other enough to want to go away together feels unearned. Scott Pilgrim never really seemed like a series to me that was all that prioritized on giving Ramona much focus or depth, which was an ever-growing criticism with the book and movie, with the 5th volume even going out of its way to try and make her a more relatable character the reader could connect with more. And so when given the chance to do it all over again, I guess why wouldn't Brian take this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do what he feels is right by the character? A do-over. We gotta remember, Brian is almost 20 years older than he was when the first Scott Pilgrim volume came out. Maybe he's got something new to say. Like I've got into, the approach for the story in Scott Pilgrim Takes Off sees Ramona be much more hands-on with her exes, going to each of them individually to see if any of them were involved in the suspected kidnapping of Scott, which winds up giving her the opportunity to reconcile with them, and even acknowledge her own wrongdoings in those situations, like leaving Roxy all alone after making her think their relationship was something more than a quick fling. I really enjoyed all this, as it gives us a much greater sense of world-building compared to the purposefully narrow setup of the film where everything revolves around Scott. Now that's still the case here. For a majority of this thing, they're even making a movie about him. Descriptions of said movie having a striking resemblance to the actual Scott Pilgrim film, we'll get into it later. But it allows us to see way more of this world and the people who inhabit it, where they live, what they get up to in their everyday life. I can appreciate the much slower pacing, even if I think some of the pauses between interactions can go on for a bit too long.
Do you know this one girl with hair like this?
Ramona Flowers?
Ramona.
Because of Scott's absence, however, and this being the biggest shakeup on the story we've ever seen, it does leave quite a bit of the series feeling a tad aimless in my opinion. It's definitely a result of me heading in with expectations of what I was thinking the show would be, but because of that quick subversion, it left me wondering for a majority of these episodes, where's this going? There's an intentional decision here to show these characters as being deeper than initially thought, but because of the ending focusing so much on making it clear that the original Scott Pilgrim timeline where he did defeat the X's still happened in some form, it results in you feeling as if a lot of the moments and arcs that are integral to that story have been sidelined in favor of something different. Like, such a large focus of the Scott Pilgrim story is the love triangle between Scott, Ramona, and Knives. Scott dating Knives briefly before this new girl grabs his attention, yet in his pursuit of her and fear of taking accountability, he fails to break up with Knives until a good bit into his relationship with Ramona has already started, something he has to finally admit to both of them by the end. However, in the series, Knives is nothing more than a tertiary character. Once Scott disappears, they give her new purpose in finding a talent for playing instruments, but that central conflict that the story usually spends so much time focusing around is all but absent here after episode 1. This wouldn't be a big deal at all, considering this is obviously a different take on what we've already seen, but as I'm going to eventually get into, the series has a very meta ending that makes it clear the original plot of the books did happen in some form, and so with Scott's sudden return to the story, you get the feeling that they just want to move on to all this new stuff, without considering Scott hasn't been present for any of it. It's episode 1 Scott being placed back into his timeline, except most everyone has had some kind of growth, except for him. It causes them to shoot right past the plot points we've already seen in other media, which I understand not wanting to repeat, but also, we're really not going to put any focus on the fact that Scott was dating them both at the same time. Ramona finds out about this in one of the episodes, yet she doesn't really have much of a reaction to it, because that's not what this story is about. And so when Scott jumps back in, you can't really tell if they want to continue from where they left off, or just keep going down this different path. We have Scott reconciling and apologizing to Knives, but in context to the series so far, I don't think they've shared a single line together. It's so reliant on you having read the books and seen the movies, but at the same time, it wants you to know this isn't either of those same timelines. Like, by the end of the series, Knives suddenly adopts the outfit she wears in the movie and book, yet they fail to consider the reason why she's wearing that outfit in the first place. Both times, it's to fight Ramona to win back Scott. It's this weird middle ground where they're trying to follow the events of the other media while not really including any story beats from said other media to justify it. It's hard to really go into what I like and don't like about Takes Off without talking about the final 2 episodes, so if you're worried about spoilers and somehow got this far, then see ya, bye, be sure to subscribe on the way out. We find out that Scott wasn't actually kidnapped by one of the evil X's. Instead, the person to kidnap him was Scott. From the future. This Scott comes from a timeline where he did defeat all of Ramona's evil X's, events playing out extremely similarly to those of the book and movie, although some stuff is left out, like anything to do with Nega Scott. This is the same universe where Scott fought for his lady, but things didn't end well. After eventually getting married and subsequently running into a rough patch, Scott refused to even speak to Ramona for 10 years. Realizing that if he goes back in time and forces past Scott to never fight for her, then it'll save him from all this heartbreak later. Then, upon Scott returning to his time period and still continuing to seek Ramona, his future self once again transports him, along with everyone involved in this story, to this empty landscape, revealing that he had spent the last 10 years training to just straight up kill him. Wow. Talk about a shift in direction. There's a lot I genuinely love about this new approach, but also certain decisions that I wasn't as big a fan of and was more so confused about what they were trying to say about these characters. So let's start with the good and work our way to the bad, but really not bad, more just like choices I felt like discussing. First, the good. This whole ending where Scott is actually the bad guy comes out of nowhere, and I'm sure to some it seems like a major slap in the face to the character, but I actually really like it. Scott Pilgrim has become one of the major you're missing the point by idolizing them characters, and so I can see the mindset in wanting to showcase the world outside of his perspective. I make it obvious that Scott literally just beating Ramona's exes to death isn't enough to make the relationship work. That just because he won her doesn't suddenly mean he gains the emotional maturity to handle something long time, especially if this version of the character never had his own Nega Scott moment where he accepts those negative traits as being part of him so he can start to improve upon them. And so to show that Scott has the possibility of becoming Ramona's most evil ex-boyfriend of all is a fun idea to explore. Michael Cera is just so darn likable in the movie. So much so that a lot of people don't even realize that you're not supposed to think he's the good guy. So it's like tricking the people who misunderstand his character into seeing him be called out on a larger scale. But again, it's something you're only gonna get if you've seen the other Scott Pilgrim material, because this show spends such little time on him that you don't even really get to see much of him being an asshole other than with knives, I guess. I don't know, maybe they could have done some more flashbacks to get that point across, having the people in town all giving their stories that give off this impression to Ramona that Scott wasn't this lovable, quirky guy he presents himself as. This entire show is one big reflection on the Scott Pilgrim franchise from Brian Lee O'Malley's point of view, to take a look back at how the other adaptations have handled it and to offer a new mindset towards the events that transpired, something less black and white. It feels like an acknowledgement to not only further growth for Scott, but growth for Brian as an author too, to show how not much separates Scott from the exes and to show how they all need to grow, to almost prove to you that Scott and Ramona's relationship isn't just some manic pixie dream girl situation, that it's something real and something both of them need to continue fighting for. Yet saying all that, there were a few things that stuck out to me that I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of, and stuff that muddies the overall picture and results in me, while appreciating the more nuanced approach they've taken, still thinking that at the end of the day, the movie's better. One big comparison between the two that I couldn't shake was that the movie, surprisingly, felt like it had way more heart. They had to cram so much into a 2-hour runtime that it's constantly sprinting at a breakneck speed, and because of that, they end up putting so much character into every scene while still finding ways to insert and show off everyone's personalities in as little time as possible, which adds to why a lot of them feel so one-note, but also makes the movie so much more fun in my opinion. On top of that, the absence of Scott made me a little disappointed, as it meant we'd be missing a lot of the more heartfelt, sweeter moments that showed you more of his dynamics with everyone, each having a small but satisfying setup and payoff, like with Kim.
I can barely remember. It was high school. She had freckles.
That's it?
Yeah.
Not that I care. You should go talk to her before she's gone.
Thanks, Kim.
And I really don't care.
And Kim, I'm sorry about everything. I'm sorry about me.
Scott and Kim barely interact in the series. Of course, these were replaced in favor of similar moments with Ramona, but the show is called Scott Pilgrim. Oh, I get the takes off now. I don't know, I guess it's just one of those irrational fan things, where I get why it was done. I get that the original still exists, but it's hard for me not to think that the movie has way more moments that are gonna stick out in my mind compared to the series.
Sorry, I guess.
You just headbutted my boyfriend so hard he burst.
Kicked my heart in the ass, so guess we're even. Natalie?
No one calls me that anymore.
Maybe they should.
I don't even think these two characters speak once in the show. It's moments like these that I really feel are missing from the series, that for the most part tries not to get away from its comedic and action-packed tone. These moments exist here, sure, but nothing really stood out to me like in the film. Not only do we meet future Scott here, but we also get to see future Ramona, who is the one to take regular Scott back to his point in time. But she's also someone that I felt was underutilized. You could kind of feel them running out of time by this point. The series makes such an effort to give Ramona more depth, but I still think this future stuff focuses too much on Scott's flaws while not showing how much of a give and take a relationship like this is. Like, they make a big effort to show how irrational Scott is by leaving Ramona in the future, yet they never really go into what the issue was, and so you're left with an event that's pretty much treated as being a Scott problem. That he was the sole person here keeping them from being happy together. And I get why it was done and all, I know it's to show how much he needed to keep working on himself, but Scott's barely in this show. They make such an effort to show how Ramona has the problem of running away when things get bad, that I find it confusing how they mostly treat her future self as a perfect person, someone who was unequivocally in the right. Like, the Ramona we follow in this series is the one who confronted her past, not future Ramona. So wouldn't it have made more sense to show that the world in which Scott defeated all the exes was worse for both of them? What if it was about Ramona running away in the future, and that's what caused Scott to become another evil ex? That would even build upon a throwaway line in the movie.
Just another evil ex waiting to happen.
I don't know, you might disagree with that and perhaps I was missing something. If you want to provide your own take in the comments, go right ahead. This was just based off first time viewing. I guess I mainly find it weird because it allows Scott to skip right past all the development we see him go through in the movie and book. Again, he's been plopped into a world where everyone else has had some kind of growth. And so it seems a little too quick and simple to basically go, here's you in the future, he's a jerk, don't be like that. I was also going to continue a big thing here about how I don't like the idea of this literally being movie or book Scott, because again, it kind of ignores the growth he did go through in those, but Brian Lee O'Malley went out of his way recently to specify they are not the same Scott, which kind of makes this issue something not even worth talking about. I can see why that would have really upset some people. I always hated it when sequels just tried to ignore certain developments from the original. Like in Ted, for example, the entire thing is about Mark Wahlberg trying to fix his relationship with Mila Kunis and ends with him getting married happily ever after. Yet the sequel just opens up with, "No, I know you guys got divorced an undisclosed period of time ago." Like, thanks, dude, the original is ruined for me now. Either way, different Scott, fine by me. But it's that reason why I don't fully agree when folks call this a sequel to the books of the movie. That almost ruins it in my opinion. I think this show works miles better when being treated as its own thing, its own timeline, its own take on the Scott Pilgrim story. Things just get a bit messy when they go out of their way to correlate so many things to both of those. It was like they couldn't decide on whether or not they wanted to commit to the sequel decision until it was too late, and so certain things just feel off. Because it is so reliant on you having seen other Scott Pilgrim adaptations. But who knows, maybe the explanation was in front of us the whole time.
You know Sonic the Hedgehog? In the early 90s, there were 2 different Sonic cartoons airing at the same time. And the same guy played Sonic in both shows. Isn't that wild?
That's what this show is. The same general plot, the same actors, but at the same time, it's a different thing altogether, and it's gotta be viewed that way. The show rides a very fine line that, when tilted either way, can change my perception on the whole thing. If I look at it as a continuation of the book or the movie, I'm disappointed that they choose to ignore all the growth Scott went through in them, in favor of leaning more into what the general perception of the character is on the internet. But if I look at it as its own thing, then I can't help but shake that so much of what I enjoy about Scott Pilgrim is absent here, leaving us with a Scott and Ramona relationship that, albeit intentionally, feels more underdeveloped than ever. Ending with what is now going to be the start of the relationship. And so at the end of the day, I guess I'm fine just being stuck here in some kind of middle ground. After sitting on it, I think I would have rather had this over yet another retelling of the same story. In a lot of ways, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off was kind of refreshing in an age where word-for-word, shot-for-shot remakes have become the norm. Like, look at this, I've spent the last 20 minutes talking about and discussing the series. This show has genuinely made me sit down and think about what I appreciate in the original, and how it compares to this different take. I'd much rather that than just the movie again, but animated. Saying that, I think I'm also just sort of done on Scott Pilgrim remakes for the time being. We've seen this story be told from just about every angle it could. So I'm hoping if there's anything else to do with this franchise in the future, it continues to try to be something new. Or let it die, that's cool too. And if that's the case, I'm at least glad to say that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off was a worthy send-off. Even if I don't think all its ideas were executed flawlessly. It has officially been almost 3 years since the release of the Patrick Star Show, and 2 years since my video on it, if you could believe that, where I touted it and SpongeBob's other spin-off, Camp Coral, as being awful, me even claiming the Patrick Show to be one of the worst shows I've ever seen, and I've seen like 3, 4 even, and while I was very harsh towards it, probably the harshest I've ever been towards a cartoon, it's interesting to consider that the Patrick Show has managed to keep on truckin', despite near universal backlash from critics. Whereas Camp Coral, which was slightly more well received, again slightly, since my last video has only managed to release an added 13 or so episodes, again in the span of 2 years. The Patrick Show, on the other hand, has pumped out a pretty impressive 57, which is crazy considering most shows these days are lucky to get 10 episodes in a season before getting cancelled as a tax write-off. So if anything, it's nice to see a show be given this much attention, even if it is a spin-off based off one of the biggest children's IPs in the world. Hopefully the same confidence is given towards that new rock, paper, scissors show, which seems pretty funny.
Material, so the reported levels from the census are essentially null and void.
Well, you are a child.
In this case, the sheer amount of episodes given seems to have really benefited the Patrick Show in the eyes of the public, with me seeing folks on social media sing the cartoon's praises way more frequently. It seems we're long past the days of people brushing it aside based off 20-year-old interview excerpts by Steven Hillenburg. Congratulations, The Patrick Show, that's an achievement, genuinely. Again, it is no secret that I was incredibly harsh towards it, for reasons other than the aforementioned getting mad on a dead man's behalf. I couldn't care less. RIP. But the more I saw folks talking about the significant improvement the show has taken, especially in its second season, the more I find myself baffled. I thought The Patrick Show, despite featuring some insanely creative and fun animation, seriously suffered from a lack of focus, aiming to sideline a general story structure in favor of drawn-out, nonsensical gags which weren't entertaining nor funny, episodes ending with you feeling nothing more than, well, why did I just watch that? Which felt even more pointless due to the fact that the main series was already doing the same thing. It was basically just a more gag-driven SpongeBob, at a time when SpongeBob was arguably at its most gaggiest of gag-driven. I don't know, I'd like to think the way I approach things has shifted since that point in time. I also got a microphone that doesn't peak every other second since then, that's nice too. And so today, given its apparent resurgence in recent times, I thought it would be only fair to check up on The Patrick Show, see how it's doing in the year of our Lord and Savior, and whether or not there's any merit to, well, its own existence. I mean, yeah, basically. During this revisit, I decided to check out the first couple episodes of the series again to see if my views had changed at all, and sadly, I was only reminded of why my initial reaction to the series was so negative. And it's because I think the first episode of this show is really, really bad. I always like first episodes that naturally introduce you to the characters and the world they live in, while showing you an average day in their lives. And while the Patrick show does feature a pretty standard story and lets you get to know each of Patrick's family members, I think it flops like a fish in making any of it feel natural, or in making you interested in what's going on with this new setup. You know, the last way I would ever think to naturally establish my main set of characters would be for Patrick to spend up until the first half of the episode, no exaggeration, just walking across the dining room table and naming each of them. No conversation going on, they just get their funny quip, and then we move on to the next, him literally forgetting who his grandpet is just so he can make the audience aware of who this randomly inserted character is. I'm Grandpat, don't you remember? I've been here since episode 1, look there I am, see? Which is even more baffling considering the show's intro already does this.
Hi, I'm Patrick Star, and I live with my parents!
From here we get to see what the episode is actually about. Patrick keeps missing breakfast and is starving. So what do we see him do about this? Well, he starts by looking for food, his grandpat tells him a story about hunting, he does a segment on his TV show about cooking, he then realizes that during that he's missed their designated food time again, but then it's all good because they're having another meal right after. Amazing. Like, that is the exact rundown. I don't believe I'm missing anything important out of that. It's such a slow and drawn-out farce of a story where nothing actually happens, and the pacing isn't fast enough to make up for the fact that nothing's going on. All I got out of these first few episodes is the occasional funny visual gag. I don't know why this drawing made me laugh so hard.
I think it's time for the talk.
Put down the baseball mitt, son.
Sure, it looks nice, and all their attempts to switch up the art style is appreciated, including some stellar stop motion, and I think the storyboarding for this show is particularly great, especially compared to a lot of other cartoons today, and I absolutely adore the background art with that fun-colored pencil style. But all of these great visuals are in service of nothing if I don't care about what's going on. I need something to latch onto. I think I was a little too focused in my previous video about a cartoon needing some kind of 3-act plot. Just because it's something that I prefer, doesn't mean that just trying to be zany and fun is automatically bad. But I think the slow start of the Patrick show really did itself a disservice. Because as the season goes on, I think it actually manages to improve a lot, and it's because of one simple factor: the pacing. There are episodes here I really do hate, like Star Wars, which is just a slog to get through, with Patrick and his grandpat having a stare-off which quickly escalates into this giant all-out war. But for me personally, I just wasn't invested in the why. There's no reason or consequence around what we're seeing, it's just them bringing more and more people into their war to basically stand around until the episode's over. I don't know what I'm meant to care about here. But comparatively, Season 1 has episodes like Fitzpatrick, which I find myself really enjoying, and it's because it's super fast and to the point. From the get-go, you understand how ridiculous of an idea this is, but the show never stops to acknowledge it. Patrick's Irish evil twin shows up and he wants to ruin his life by framing him for a bunch of misdeeds, Sonic Adventure 2 style. And so they just run with it, them going from location to location seeing him attempt to tarnish Patrick's good name. It works so well for me because there's a focal point. There's a through line that's broad enough to do a bunch of shit with, but not so broad that it feels like this is a show about nothing.
How do we know when it's over?
The idea of taking this evil, malignant character who's trying to create chaos in a world that's already unbridled chaos is a funny idea, and so seeing him constantly feel through Patrick's sheer ignorance is funny. If I had one complaint, it's that even in some of the best episodes here, I find the endings are pretty rushed. For example, here after doing a bunch of heinous shit, a door in Patrick's room just opens and sucks him in. All's well that ends well. Nothing brought it on, which leads you to believe this could have happened at any point in the episode. It doesn't ruin it, again, I still enjoyed it a lot, but stuff like that certainly leaves me with a confusing taste in my mouth. Like, why even have an ending at that point? Just cut to black if you care that little.
Look at this! There's skid marks on all his underwear!
What? And I'm sure we all heard about the season finale, which featured the Bubble Bass review segment, where Bubble Bass, naturally, a character the show has grown quite fond of in recent years, is seen doing his own internet cartoon criticism video shitting all over the in-universe Patrick show. And what do you know, it manages to be really, really funny, which in my opinion was due to how laser-focused it was on the concept. There's a lot to poke fun at with the topic. The character PNGs, the exaggerated performance, the large focus on negativity. And they hit each and every one of those gags without ever feeling like it's dwelling on any one of them for too long. They give you a quick joke, then move on to the next. That way they're constantly hitting you with gags to the point where you're going to find at least a few of them humorous, and it's something I appreciated more about the series as it went on. Nothing much of note is happening, but the faster pace allows them to do so much more with their basic ideas. You get the idea that it's almost like at a certain point the show got overtaken by fans, and I mean that in a good way, where they're trying to elevate the material and take it to new places instead of just trying to bring back the stuff fans recognize for the sake of making you remember the glory days. Like that other show. Apparently around 2/3 into the season there was a big switch up with the staff working on the show, with a lot of new folks being brought in, compared to the largely similar crew that was previously shared between Patrick and the main series. And while I don't think that was a direct cause of the quality increase, again there were a lot of episodes before that I actually find myself enjoying a lot, but I think at the very least it was able to breathe some new life into the series, in that it offers us something drastically different to what you're going to find with regular SpongeBob. It appears the series also moved back to being fully board-driven compared to the script-driven approach it had previously, which is extremely rare these days. You know, so rare that the show didn't start that way, despite it obviously being the more favorable method for it to choose given its tone and style of comedy. Season 2 from the get-go starts completely off the walls. The show has evolved into this meta-experience that's not even somewhat attempting to take itself seriously, building off the best of the first season and expanding upon it. The first episode sees the Patrick Star Show, again in-universe, also begin its second season, in which they immediately blow the entire budget within seconds and have to spend the entire rest of the episode endlessly shilling products to make their money back. I mentioned it before, but I think what I learned to enjoy so much about the series, especially as it went on, is that it never dwells on anything, and it's something I appreciate. Quick nod to the original show, gone in a second to free him sometimes. Making a gag about the animation process altogether, that's all it is, a gag. It's moving at such a fast rate that there's more opportunity for shit to catch you off guard.
It's gonna be just fine.
Wow!
That's not to mention how much more creative the plots in general have gotten. I really liked this one that featured one of Patrick's mum's tattoos getting lost on another body and having to get back to reconnect with his girlfriend. It was really well done. Or the recent episode where Patrick wakes up completely off model.
Patrick Star!
Now he has to find a way to get things back to normal by traveling through the show's future seasons.
Welcome to the new Patrick Show. Today we're gonna talk about friendship.
The fact that made Steven Universe fans really mad made it even funnier. I mean, guys, it was clearly done in jest. I genuinely wasn't expecting my opinion on this show to shift so much. And while it's not my favorite cartoon or anything, I think I'll just always prefer something with a larger focus on character-driven writing and comedy. I certainly think the Patrick Star Show has done more than enough to stand out and justify its own existence. Some might argue why it even had to do that. Why can't it just do what it wants without having to prove itself to anyone? And I think it simply comes back to the fact that current SpongeBob is in a much different place from where it started. For better or worse, you can be the judge, I don't care either way. There's no arguing that upon announcement, there was a large feeling in the air that the Patrick Show felt rather pointless. Something unneeded. When your network only has 3, 4 at most new cartoons airing at a time, why would I want half of that to be what's essentially the same show? SpongeBob switched to being more gag-driven in the past few seasons, and so why do we need another show that fulfills that same purpose? But through watching more of it, I think I've begun to recognize and appreciate the ways in which this show manages to be different to its sister show. You know, similar doesn't mean the same. And so no matter what Nickelodeon's reasons were for greenlighting the Patrick Show, money, I think the crew, especially in its second season, have shown just why the Patrick Show deserves to be viewed and enjoyed as its own thing, doing something that, at this point in time more than ever, is rarely done in cartoons. And that is being cartoony. Shocker, I know. And I'm glad to see they find their groove. I'd recommend checking the show out, especially its second season. It's not for everyone. Hell, again, I'd contest whether or not it's even for me. But there's a lot to like here for sure. And I do feel bad for jumping the gun on it so soon. Steven Universe has one of the most interesting reputations of any cartoon that's released in the past decade. Wait, it's officially over a decade old? Ow. Depending on who you ask, you'll either be told that it's one of the best cartoons ever to grace our screens, that it's impacted the animation industry in so many excellent ways, while on the other side of the spectrum, you'll have a flurry of folks telling you how it's one of the worst cartoons in recent times, that its issues vastly outweigh whatever few minor positives it contains, and had an incredibly negative impact on animation nowadays. Where do I fall in? Well, I wanted to know too. See, because of all this, it's given Steven Universe a pretty bad reputation online. Those who hate it don't like when it gets attention, and those who do like it sometimes feel as if they can't express that without the other side trying to explain to them why they're wrong, and everyone in the middle just being fed up with the discussion. And in a way, I think it's impacted how I view this show. Like, I've made quite a few jokes over the years at Steven Universe's expense. It's a pretty easy punchline at this rate. But it's strange because at one point in time not too long ago, I would have safely said that Steven Universe was my favorite cartoon, ever. Yeah, among my many other obsessions I like to hide from the public, there were a good few years where I was a massive Steven Universe fan. I watched every episode multiple times, knew all the songs, had entire scenes I could recite word for word. Look, I don't show this often, guys, and by don't show often, I mean I never show this, but you want to take a look at one of the first profile pictures I had for this very channel you watch today? And then have like stock gasping. If you zoom in really close, you can even see the Steven that was poorly cropped out so I could color pick the jacket. I wish I could say that was the worst I had, but that would be a lie. Look, do I need to prove it anymore? I loved this show. However, over the years as I got older and newer seasons started to release, there was just something about it that didn't click the same with me, and I never really figured out what that was. Around season 3, it was some watermelon island thing, was when I could really feel myself checking out, getting more and more fed up with it. And while I did stick around to the end, even watching the movie in future when they came out, I can't really say that I was all that hyped with the many finales we've received. Certainly not enough to want more of it. Jesus, people, just let a thing end for once. Point being, clearly I felt like something was there at first to obsess so much of my time around consuming its content, particularly in the show's early years. Which is weird, because if there's one thing that both of these entirely conflicting sides can agree on, it's that Season 1 is pretty weak. I always thought that Season 1 was the strongest, only to slowly dip in quality over time, but then again, I was like 14 when I watched it, so perhaps I was simply clouded by childhood nostalgia, and that the series' eventual change was actually for the better, and I just couldn't handle it because change is scary. I guess we'll never know. Unless I watch the show again. Wait a minute! That's what you're watching right now! So I went back and watched all 53 episodes of Steven Universe Season 1 for the first time in around 6 or 7 years. To answer the question that has plagued a generation. Was Steven Universe bad from the start? At first I was going to make a single video on the entire show to track what I believe to be its gradual downfall, but then I thought about it more and realized that this here, the quality of the beginning of the series, was really what I wanted to get to the bottom of. Especially because a lot of Steven Universe fans genuinely believe that if you want to check out the show that you should simply skip a majority of its first season. Yeah, that sure is a vote of confidence right there. But if you guys do end up enjoying this analysis and want to see me go over the rest of the series, I'd probably just do like Season 2, 3, 4, 5, the movie and future in one single mega video. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see that and I'll heavily consider it. Also, subscribe. No relevance. Would just be nice. Steven Universe was created by one Rebecca Sugar, who worked as a board artist on Adventure Time, with her being known for many of the most beloved episodes of that series as well as the music. She had started developing the show as far back as 2009, for a program Rob Sorcher launched where the company was looking for talent, presumably from inside the company, to come up with new cartoon ideas for the network, which resulted in 6 of these pilots eventually being released online. Of the 6, only 3 eventually became full series: Clarence OKKO, at the time known as Liquid Plaza Turbo, and of course, Mars Safari. Steven Universe. Going back to this pilot with the series having long ended is so bizarre. All the pieces are clearly there, even hinting at future plot points that would eventually find itself in the main show, but it just looks so strange. Steven and Amethyst look relatively similar, Garnet just has her hair down, but Jesus Christ, they took a complete 180 with Pearl's design. The backgrounds too have much more detail, with the whole thing just looking way darker compared to the bright pastel colors they eventually went with. Apparently, the art style was changed due to them trying to simplify it in a way that would make it more adaptable to board artists, and I gotta say, that decision was certainly for the better. While this art style is clearly more in line with Rebecca Sugar's other work from around then, I have to say the new style just looks better, especially for the target demographic. Maybe I'm wrong on this, but I don't think the show would have been anywhere near as iconic if it looked like this. Other than the visuals, however, the writing and tone is pretty one-to-one with how the series would end up upon being greenlit. The whole premise for the pilot was even used later in the show itself. But I do enjoy how simple things are here. The gems get back from a mission, and Amethyst gives Steven this little trinket which he later finds out can send him back in time to fulfill a singular purpose, and so he, of course, uses it for comebacks. Yet by the end, he finds a way to use this ability to eat the gems against a monster, redeeming himself. It's a great pilot in my opinion, certainly a lot better than some of the other pilots that came alongside it. I can completely see why it was eventually picked up for a full series. It stands itself apart so much. Compared to a lot of these other pilots which were aiming for your usual Cartoon Network random and wacky shtick, Steven Universe gives off this super slow, relaxing vibe at first, before spearheading you right into action at the end. With all the characters feeling super fleshed out in just 7 minutes, the world feels lived in. There's a certain charm about it that's hard to describe.
You know that, right? You're a big joke.
I especially love Steven's expressions. The little stress lines they give him at times do a great job at showing how fucking desperately he wants to be part of the Crystal Gems. All of this is to say, I think this is a really good pilot for the show. I can see why the studio may have been hesitant at first, given this is a show for boys aged 6 to 11 where 3 of the main 4 characters are women, but I can also see exactly how this pilot would have won them over, if only they knew back then what they were in for. So, by the time I find Steven Universe, they were well into the 2nd season. I've talked about this many times in the past, but there was a long period where I was very much ashamed to like cartoons, and so understandably let this show go right past my radar. I think the only time I ever stopped to watch a full episode out of curiosity was when they did the Uncle Grandpa crossover. I hadn't seen a single episode from either of these, I don't know why I made this my first experience with both, but that all changed one day. And I'm sure I'm gonna be judged for this, but my first time ever watching Steven Universe was through reaction videos. I'll just put the bag over my face now. I was looking for episodes of Sonic Boom, which was new at the time, and because I didn't have a computer and didn't know how to pirate stuff on my phone, I had to settle for the next best thing, which was watching somebody on YouTube watch the episode. After a while, the reactionist started watching Steven Universe episodes too, and I figured, hey, why not? No one can judge me for watching this while I'm on a phone. And so for the entirety of Season 1 and for a majority of Season 2, I was watching the show really zoomed out with a guy talking over the whole thing. And I loved it. So this'll be interesting for me. My first time ever truly watching Steven Universe on its own. Was Season 1 really that bad for both sides to be in agreement over it? Let's find out. Steven Universe stars Steven Universe. Hold the phone. He lives in the coastal town of Beach City, residing just outside of the rest of civilization in this little house built into a mountain. Despite this, his dad Greg doesn't live with him, instead sleeping inside his van like a true gamer. Now, Steven is rather under the guidance of the Crystal Gems, 3 warriors who were allies of Steven's mother Rose, who gave up her physical form to have him, leaving him as this never-before-seen human gem hybrid. And so with no idea what he's capable of, Steven has to train with the gems to learn how to unlock and control his mother's powers, while battling monsters alongside Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl. I think the first episode of the series does a pretty stellar job at introducing you to this world and the characters, while hinting at more going on underneath the surface, because in terms of what's going on, it's fairly minimal. Your average monster of the week formula where a new foe shows up every week for the gems to fight and Steven to do Steven stuff. It perfectly sets you up for what's in store, introducing the characters as well as giving Steven one-on-one scenes with each of the gems to see how all their mindsets seem to differ, with Steven just being stuck in the middle of it all, being steered every which way, while also trying to prove himself as a valuable member of the team. There's also a great deal of foreshadowing in here that I completely forgot about, such as how when Steven opens his freezer you can see a strange glowing ring, which you wouldn't know the payoff for until all the way into episode 7. I love seeing junk like that in cartoons, makes it feel like the writers had a plan for all this. One of the main criticisms towards the first season of Steven Universe was how much more episodic in nature it was, but as I'm going to get into later, I don't think that's a bad thing at all. But there was still a lot of continuity present from episode 1. Another one of the main criticisms of season 1 of Steven Universe is Steven Universe. A lot of folks were not a fan of Steven during the beginning of the show, with most finding him to be an annoying nuisance whoever only seems to hinder the gems without adding much to the team, at least not enough for them to warrant keeping him around. Which is strange because I personally never saw it that way. I think what prevents Steven from veering too far into being an unlikable protagonist, especially compared to a lot of other shows that suffer from this very issue, is that they know when to drop the act and have him see situations for how they are, but also they know when to let him, you know, just be a kid. The guy is 13 years old. Are you really gonna sit there and tell me you weren't annoying when you were 13? Unless, you know, you're a 13-year-old watching this video, in which case, you know, you're cool. I mean, that goes without saying. It's all a balancing act. For as much time as Steven is childish or annoying, there's just as much time dedicated to showing his other character traits, like how caring he is or his emotional intelligence. It's even something the show itself tries to acknowledge at one point, and because of that, it comes off more like you're watching this kid grow up.
I can't believe it. I'm so annoying.
I think a pretty important line to draw when it comes to not making your character come off too annoying is asking yourself the question, are they being naive here, or just being stupid? I think a really lazy way to write a character is to just say, oh, they're the stupid one, because that can mean so many things. Why are they stupid? Is it ignorance, their upbringing? It may seem really lame to try and add depth to a trait that in concept is so silly and unserious, but it's more so from a writer's perspective. It's why I think a character like Patrick from SpongeBob works so well in the early seasons compared to the later episodes. Early on, he was this chill guy who spends all his time just lounging around, but when he's asked for advice by the naive SpongeBob, he wants to act like he knows everything. The comedy comes from him thinking he's some mentor figure, and SpongeBob being so gullible to accept what he has to say as fact. It isn't just two stupid friends do stupid thing because they're stupid. And generally, I think Steven Universe accomplishes this with his character pretty well. Generally. There are a few episodes here where I do straight up just not like him. I think Together Breakfast is probably his worst episode in the whole show, you know, purely from Steven's character point of view. He makes this breakfast and wants to enjoy it with all the gems because they're always too busy to do stuff with him. What do you know, they're too busy to do stuff with him, and so he chases them around the inside of the temple for them all to enjoy the meal together. Doesn't sound so bad, and actually can make you sympathize for him in a way. But they fumble pretty hard in just making him straight up ignorant towards his surroundings. Like when Garnet is perfectly burning this thing that she told him about at the start of the episode, going over how important it is to get rid of it, and so when he sees her doing what she said she'd be doing, naturally, he starts screaming to take her focus away from it. And even after being told by the other gems and Garnet herself to leave, he continues screaming about his dumb fucking waffles or whatever. But see, this episode, overall, is merely an outlier. In most other episodes, while sure he's always portrayed to be intrigued by the gem stuff and expresses his disappointment when he isn't allowed to partake, it all feels like natural kid dialogue. You can understand why he feels that way and why sometimes he tries to push his luck. The whole season is really about him proving himself to the gems, and so it makes sense why he'd go against their orders at times. Another reason I see a lot of folks saying he's annoying is because of his voice, and I think I might actually have an unpopular opinion here about the matter. Me? An unpopular opinion? I know it's crazy. But if anything, I actually think Steven's voice gets more annoying as the series goes on. At least during the first half of season 1 he sounds like a kid, you know, because the voice actor was a kid. But as it goes on, it sounds like he's trying to put on a more squeaky voice more and more to sound younger, and as a result it just sounds like it's trying way too hard to be cutesy or whatever, and that definitely got more annoying for me over time.
Hey, Lars. Just give me 3 donuts.
This can't be happening! This has to be a dream! Lars! Lars! Please tell me I'm dreaming!
Oh, but I don't really have anything against squares. I like all basic shapes.
I also wasn't a fan of when his voice actor was clearly going through puberty, so his voice gets super high-pitched and squeaky. But like, I get it, you can't stop his voice from aging. Or can you? But while I initially found this pretty annoying, I did find that certain scenes of later episodes were instead made stronger with Steven's ever-changing voice. One of Zach Callison's strongest moments in the show, in my opinion, is in Rose's Scabbard, where after some emotional junk that I'll get into later happens, Steven is desperately chasing after Pearl, not understanding why she's upset or if she's mad at him, and his squeaky, puberty-filled voice really excels the performance here. It sounds like his vocal cords are gonna rip out at certain points with how much he yells, but it adds so much to the struggle.
Pearl! Did I do something wrong? You gotta tell me!
This is all coincidental that the episode's landed at this point in his voice changing, sure, but I still really love it here, that you can hear the character going through this change, and it's reflective of how much more mature he begins to act as the season goes on. So all in all, I like Steven. I think he's one of the best ever kid characters ever written in a cartoon. Season 1 at least. Next up, we've got Garnet, the leader of the Crystal Gems. She's fine. I'm pretty sure that Garnet is like the most popular among the 3 main gems, because she's so awesome and calm and collected and cooler. But I don't know, I never really thought much of her. Probably because she barely says anything. Yeah, with a character whose whole trait is to keep words to a minimum, I never really find myself becoming all that attached to Garnet. She's mainly just used as a central role model for Steven, or at least is the gem whose approval is sought after the most, even by the others. She doesn't get a whole lot of development throughout the first season. A lot of her character here is that she's mysterious. And while she definitely becomes more of a standout character later on, hell, even with the season 1 finale, I never personally cared for her throughout the first season. Makes coming back to it kinda hard in a way because it barely feels like she's there half the time. That isn't to say there's no standout moments with her. I mainly like how despite sparingly using her for anything of much importance, when they do it's generally to defend Steven against the others when they're insulting or criticizing him. You get this vibe that she really cares and loves for the kid but just doesn't express it all the time. Her calm nature also makes the moments when she does lose her shit all the more impactful. Like in Mirror Gem when Steven hits her away, knocking her glasses off. You can really feel the tension since we're not used to seeing her act this way towards him. One of my favorite episodes featuring Garnet, one of my favorite episodes of the whole series, would have to be Future Vision, where Garnet lets Steven know that she has the ability to see into the future, to pick the best outcome imaginable. This completely breaks his brain as he starts to overwhelm himself by thinking of all the ways his seemingly innocuous actions can harm him. Throughout the series, we always see the gems refrain from letting Steven in on what's going on behind the scenes, so it makes you wonder why she would do this to him, especially since she has the ability to know the risk of that. And it leads to one of the best moments in the whole show.
I took a risk at your expense. There was a chance you'd understand this and we'd be closer. I see so many things that can hurt you. I should never have let one of them be me.
I understand and in a way appreciate why scenes like this are seldom done with Garnet. It adds to the impact given how rare it is. But I guess I just never really cared much about this kind of archetype in the first place, the silent but deadly powerhouse. And Estelle is most definitely the weakest voice actor on the show, which doesn't help. Being a singer and not really a voice actress is very obvious, with how awkwardly some of these lines are delivered, but in a way I suppose that adds to the character, I guess. It somewhat fits, but I don't think it was intentional. So overall, Garnet mostly remains as a character who more often than not has me like, that was cool, I guess. I fucking hate Amethyst, though. Amethyst is the chill one of the group, having a pretty lax approach to their missions and overall lifestyle, being this big slob who lives in filth. She's mostly used for comic relief, with most of her jokes just being, "She's gross," or "Wow, that was rude." And after a while, it just gets tiring. Scratch that, it gets tiring after episode 1. I can understand why some people would like her, but I personally just can't deal with her half the time. Which is alright, because next to Garnet, she gets very little focus throughout season 1. I can only really think of 3 or 4 episodes where she's the star, and more often than not, it results in some pretty mixed ones. Like, there are episodes where I like Amethyst. There are even a couple where I love Amethyst. But there's also just as many where I fucking hate her. I'm probably not alone on this, but I think the best Amethyst episode of season 1 has gotta be Tiger Millionaire. Yeah, no, that's a joke. My favorite Amethyst episode would definitely have to be On the Run, where she decides to show Steven where she came from, that being a hole inside of a mountain surrounded by a bunch of other holes, revealing that she was made on Earth unlike the other gems who came from space. They do an excellent job of building up this creepy, mysterious atmosphere around what we find out is known as the kindergarten, with Amethyst being just big enough for you to suddenly start questioning who she even is or what her purpose was.
Stop, and we shut this place down so the Earth would be safe from parasites like me! Amethyst!
Pearl comes in to take Steven away, scolding Amethyst for even showing him this place. Her obviously not understanding that this is where Amethyst's insecurities stem from, where the place she was made from only ever being referred to as a mistake, with Pearl eventually recognizing it and the two of them having one of the rare moments in the show where they have a sweet little heartfelt moment together. It's really interesting getting to have more depth to the character, who before had only ever really been presented as a slob. Still don't like her though. Yeah, no, for all these good moments with Amethyst, there's just as many where I can't stand her, which I think mostly comes from her actions never truly being addressed by the other characters in any meaningful way. Everybody talks about this scene, but that's because it's just so awful. But there's an episode where Amethyst and Greg start to hang out, which we later find out happened once many years ago, where Greg starts to lean into her bad habits of just sitting around doing nothing all day. And when he finally realizes he's been neglecting his son and falling into the same patterns again, she starts to torment him by turning into Rose Quartz, aka his fucking dead girlfriend and the mother of his child. Pretty bad, right? But that's not why it sucks. If anything, I think it's a great scene on its own, highlighting how despite being the good guys of the series, the gems have the ability to do terrible actions with the intent of hurting people. But it's the way they treat it afterwards that makes things fall apart. Like, the whole thing that stops her is that Steven walks in them, making Amethyst run away ashamed. But like, she only stopped because she was caught. This is also implied to have happened at least once before, so it's not like she felt remorse then. Then in the following scene, everything is all hunky-dory because she cleaned his storage unit for him. Wonderful. She can barely even face him, no sorry or anything. I get it, kid show and all. But it's not like the series doesn't tackle more serious subjects frequently, and it's not like there's no sense of continuity. At least if that were the case, I would understand them being required to patch this up before the episode is over, and I get the thought process of this, like her actions show she cares and all. But there's a clear discrepancy between these two actions. I don't think one makes up for the other. Amethyst is my least favorite character of the main 4, and even then, it's not like she's abhorrent or anything. I guess I was just never a big fan of this kind of character. See, I feel like someone's favorite crystal gem says a lot about them. So if you know anything about me, you'd be right in assuming that I think Pearl is the best gem of all. No contest. Hey, what can I say? I like this archetype. She's basically just a female Jeff from Clarence. And hey, the writers evidently agreed with me here, because fucking half of season 1 is dedicated to Pearl. She gets way more attention in starring episodes than any other gem. And I mean, I'm not complaining. Pearl is the neat and tidy one of the group. She was Rose's longest and most loyal ally, and therefore cares a great deal for her, always reminiscing about how amazing of a person she was, how she saw the beauty in everything. And because of that, I think a lot of people kind of brush Pearl off for being kind of neurotic. And they're right, but I don't know, I like it, maybe that says more about me. As I said before, Pearl gets the most attention out of any of the main 3 gems, which seems to be more from the fact that because she sees herself as being so intelligent and cares greatly about gem history, she's always willing and wanting to teach Steven about all this amazing stuff. Much like every other character in this goddamn show, a lot of her more annoying personality traits are a direct result of her insecurities. Pearl feeling empty without Rose in her life now.
Look at them. They're a mess without her guidance. Directionless, pathetic, clinging things. It's going to be okay, Garnet.
Sure.
I do really enjoy how nobody just is in this series. There's always some event that leads to them being the way they are. Coach Steven is a good example of this, where she gets jealous over the fact that Garnet would rather fuse with Amethyst over her for one of their missions, becoming jealous when Steven starts looking up to how strong they are, or they're trying to show him that there are other ways to be strong aside from just physically. And when all seems lost and she's about to be defeated by the very thing this insecurity stems from, Steven gives her the motivation to prove herself, taking down this giant woman through her intelligence alone. Pearl sees herself as lost and broken, and this is the causation for why she acts the way she does. There's more I could say about her, but that would mean going into some episodes that I'd rather see for later. But the point to all this is, I really do enjoy a majority of our main characters. Like 2 out of 4, that's like 50%. The strangest thing about Season 1 of Steven Universe is that it doesn't feel like a single season. Instead, they could have easily classified it as 2 separate ones entirely, and it would have made a lot more sense, with it coming in at a whopping 53 episodes. No other season of the series came even close to that. It's insane how big pickups were back then. Sonic Boom has 104 goddamn episodes, yet that's somehow considered only 2 seasons. Now saying that, when you get to episode 26, there's a very climatic feeling to it all, with the following episodes taking the show in what for the most part feels like an entirely new direction. So I think it'd be fitting to separate them so it's easier to discuss. I think it's important to remember that 2013 was a time before streaming was the most common way for most people to consume content. A time before a million different streaming services clawing for your eyes and attention. So understandably, Cartoon Network were a little weary about this serialized story for their new cartoon aged at voice 6 to 11. It's evident that a large chunk of Steven Universe had been planned out from the get-go. So it's clear there was always the intention to give it a grander story than what was initially presented. But airing on television, there was no way they could predict what episode somebody would be starting with. You don't want a kid checking out your show for the first time only to be dropped into the middle of an action-packed story where you're already expected to know the characters, so I get completely why they must have demanded Season 1 have a more episodic focus. It just makes the most sense. Although I think the crew, no, I'm not calling them the Crewniverse, had some super clever workarounds for this by giving the first half of Season 1 this ongoing underlying theme of Steven trying to learn how to use his powers. The plot can be as episodic as it needs to be, but as long as a majority of them feature Steven learning how to use his powers in some way, then there's at least some illusion of an ongoing story. Then once the show started to become more popular, I imagine it gave the crew more leverage to start leaning into a more serialized approach. Especially since Cartoon Network at least now has a batch of episodic stuff that can be aired out of order. I know a lot of people bitch about this aspect of the first season, but I get it. I would occasionally catch Steven Universe on the TV with my little cousin, and I can't imagine what he thought of the show, because they'd be airing random episodes from the cluster arc of Season 2, then they'd go back to early Season 1 where they have their different designs. This is not a good show to air out of order, so I'm thankful there's at least some way for kids to view it now in the way it was intended. Is what I would be saying if Warner Brothers weren't a bunch of hacks. I was watching the season on HBO Max for this video, oh sorry, I mean just Max, to see that it only contained 49 of the episodes from Season 1, with the other 4 coming after that jumping right into Season 2, but still labeling it as Season 1. Then, for Season 2, it started with the fucking Uncle Grandpa crossover, and then goes into a couple random tiny episodes that were left out of the first season, before then Season 2 continues as normal. Who is in charge of this? I can't imagine it's that hard to just go on Wikipedia and find the episode listings. This is for some reason a very common problem with certain streaming services. Like for example, The Fairly OddParents was recently added to Netflix for some reason, even though Paramount Plus exists. But they say that show came out in 2005, despite it correctly listing the right year a few months prior. But that one has this god-awful description of, anything's bound to happen when you've got fairy godparents, as 10-year-old Timmy Turner discovers when he wishes for cool parents. Did we watch the same show? I know it's even more blasphemous, calling Timmy a not-so-average kid. Timmy is an average kid. Boy, I sure hope somebody got fired for that blunder. Wait, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, Steven Universe. So now if somebody's watching the show for the first time through HBO Max, they'll suddenly get super confused as the gems flip-flop between their old and new designs, which I think was already a problem for Cartoon Network as they frequently aired episodes out of order. Doesn't streaming make content consumption so much easier? But if anything, I actually really like this slower approach to Season 1, starting off with a bunch of episodic episodes. A big pet peeve I have is when a show tries to cram in as much as they can into the first couple episodes, either due to them wanting to get to the juicy bits as quick as possible, or simply because of poor storytelling abilities. But Steven Universe starts things off super simple. There's an ongoing issue, sure, the gems are having to defeat whatever corrupted monster of the week is threatening the world, but we don't get context as to why they're doing this or what these monsters even are, until way later, which is great for rewatches, as it suddenly recontextualizes everything. That's not to somehow justify every episode of Season 1, because there certainly are a few here that I'm just not a fan of whatsoever. Like, I think Beach Party is just a terrible episode that adds nothing to the show whatsoever, simply featuring Steven inviting one of the families in town over for the titular beach party, to improve relations between the townsfolk and the Gems. But this mainly consists of a dumb little volleyball game, before they have to team up and combine their strengths to take down a monster together. The idea is fine and all, but I think one of Steven Universe's weakest aspects is the comedy. And this is an episode that's mainly focused around the silly shenanigans between the Gems and some random family. But you know, there's 53 of them, it's not like they're all gonna be winners. It's like I always say, if every episode were perfect, we wouldn't have endless online discussion about their quality. I think the best episodes here are the ones which take a regular everyday adventure and put a spin on it using Steven's magical powers. For example, So Many Birthdays is seemingly your average kid is self-conscious about getting older plot, but it starts to get interesting once Steven's gem starts shapeshifting him based on how he views himself, getting older and older until the brink of death. Not only is it a good episode on its own, but it also builds upon a plot point from all the way back in episode 6 where Steven learns how to shapeshift. Now that isn't to say that any episode that doesn't have to do with Steven's powers is automatically bad or anything. There's just one well later into the season which features Steven just having a horror movie night with the town conspiracy nut Ronaldo, and employees of the donut store he frequents Lars and Sadie. And Steven barely plays a part in any of it. It mainly focuses on the relationship between Lars and Ronaldo, with Lars being somebody hyper-focused with coming off cool, while Ronaldo is just content being himself. That self is annoying, but still. This is one of my favorite scenes of the whole show, and it doesn't even feature Steven or any of the Gems at all.
Why do you care so much about what other people think? You wouldn't say that if you knew what other people say about you!
It's simple and has nothing to do with the overall story of the show, but it's impactful, you know, it feels real, and adds a lot of depth and history to the people of the city that Steven is protecting. I mean, why should we care about the Gems protecting Beach City if we barely even know who lives there? I actually think I've got a viewpoint here that the average Steven Universe fan might disagree with, but I like the tiny episodes. Sometimes more than the regular Gem stuff. The fandom has this big resentment towards how much of the series is focused on Steven interacting with random citizens of Beach City, whether it be the mayor, or business owners, or cool kids. They'd rather it focus on Steven doing cool stuff with the Gems, but I personally think that, in Season 1 at least, the tiny episodes are a necessity, as they contrast Steven's human life with his Gem life, and how hard it is for him to try and mix those. For how much of an asshole he is, I think Lars might be one of my favorite characters just because of how much time they spend with him, showcasing how much of a prick he is and how he affects the people around him. Lars and the cool kids is another stellar one. Your average episode about Lars not wanting to be seen as lame in front of these cool kids, and is embarrassed by Steven who's just being himself, only for him to realize that nobody is impressed by his vain attempt to be cool, and instead, they respect Steven much more for just being Steven.
Sounds like it's time to buckle up!
Quit being lame, Steven. Hey man, there's nothing lame about seatbelt safety.
Lars still can't accept that the only person messing up his chances with these guys is himself, resulting in him blowing up at Steven in the end for the moss his mother used to raise absorbing the others. Which causes one of the few times in the whole series where Steven actually gets pissed the fuck off. Just look at his eyes.
What do you know about my mom? I didn't even get to know my mom! But I do know she saw beauty in everything, even in jerks like you!
They kind of go back and forth on this a lot. Again, because the show is trying to be episodic, there's a lot of moments where Lars realizes how much of an asshole he is, and then goes right back to being an asshole again by the next episode. But again, I can imagine the mandates from Cartoon Network were still pretty strict this early on, so a massive character change like this probably wasn't on the table at this point. But again, I don't mind because it gives us all these great moments. When revisiting the season, I completely forgot about Joking Victim. There's a bunch of random Season 1 episodes that escaped my mind after watching them, but upon seeing it again, I realized this is one of the best of the season. Again, very basic plot that's been done time and time again. Lars gets injured on the job, forcing Sadie to bring on Steven in order to pick up all the slack. For the past 20 episodes, there's been a very are they, aren't they approach to Lars and Sadie's relationship. You can't really tell if they are or were a thing. And here's where we get some context. That Sadie does truly care about him and might like him, but when the two try to do something nice for him, only to see that he wasn't injured at all, and instead hanging out with other guys and girls, it breaks her heart to realize that she's as important to him as he is to her. It's nothing groundbreaking, but the expressions and the way it's paced and boarded and voice acted adds to the emotion tenfold. I just like how these episodes follow along a theme of Steven trying to learn how to use his powers and use them to protect the town, but they still stand on their own, whereas episodes later in the show all blend together for me. Like, the final season of Steven Universe just exists as a fucking blur in my mind. And that's fine and all, the show is leaning way more into serialization around that time, but I just enjoy how nice and quaint this first half of season 1 is. And there's even a little bit of continuity foreshadowed in here too. When Steven later finds a VHS tape and needs a player, he immediately goes to Sadie, because in this episode she had to train him using an employee training tape. I love little details like that. Everything changes with episode 25, however. Like I said, it really feels like it was done with the approach of this being a mid-season finale, with massive events unfolding that would change the course of the series forever. In Mirror Gem, Pearl gives Steven a magic mirror that can show him different events from Gem history. However, over time it starts trying to communicate with him to the utter shock of the crystal gems. Steven can't help but feel like there's something here that he's not being let in on. And so for the first major time, Steven actively goes against the wishes of the gems to figure out the truth for himself.
He wants to be with me!
You can really feel the tension here with Steven running away to find out what's happening as fast as possible before the gems catch up with him. It's almost like it signifies Steven desperately trying to escape this episodic loop that is his everyday, as what follows is without a doubt the biggest moment in the series up until this point. As it turns out, another gem had been trapped inside the mirror, and the weirdest part of all, the gems knew she was in there the whole time. It's later implied this was because the gem would go back to Homeworld and reveal there were others living on Earth, which would result in Homeworld coming down to destroy them all, but for the time being it really puts into question these mentors Steven has been surrounding himself with, as Lapis walks away, only leaving him with this.
Don't trust them, Steven. Goodbye.
It makes you question everything you've seen. If you've really been following along the good guys this whole time. You have, but the question is intriguing nonetheless. And you find out in the second part, Ocean Gem, that the truth is a little more complicated than that.
Gems shouldn't fight each other.
We're always fighting gems, actually.
What?
Oh, how do I put this? All those monsters we fight used to be just like us, right, Pearl? Yes.
I love how they don't explain this in any episode before now. It's something that you may have not originally thought about, but becomes super obvious once it's explained to you. This is when the entire season shifts, when it starts to become way more serialized. Steven helps Lapis go home and that's it. Homeworld could now be coming for the crystal gems, or they could not. We don't know. This allows them to still have episodic stuff, while having the tease of something more going on in the background. But the very next episode, House Guest, opens up right where the last left off, letting you know that the ongoing story is going to come into play more from this point on. I forgot a lot of these episodes weren't from Season 2, honestly. And while they're not all gems, there are still a lot of great standalone episodes here, although that definitely is not the focus anymore. One of my favorite moments from all of Steven Universe is what they do with Pearl from this point on, where all these seemingly disparate plot threads come together and you're finally given context as to what it all means. Early on in the show, Steven gets this pink lion. It gravitates towards him, and so we occasionally see him hanging around it in certain episodes. But then they started doing more. 3 to be exact. All labeled in a way that would make you think they're part of some trilogy. But when you watch them, they all seem kinda unrelated. The first is Steven getting his lion, the second is Lion showing Steven some secret weapons room that he can activate, and the third shows Lion letting him inside his Mian, revealing that Lion belonged to his mother Rose, with Steven finding a strange little pocket dimension inside his Mian, retrieving a VHS tape in there she left for him, which leads into him watching it with Sadie like I said before. On their own, they all work well, especially the ending to Lion 3, which gives us our first time of being able to actually see and hear Rose talking to Steven, which in and of itself makes going back to the episode where Steven unlocks Rose's room in the temple more impactful, as the little random whale inside there shared the same voice actress. But when you get all the way to episode 45, all this stuff is brought up again, but this time in how it relates to Pearl. Pearl is extremely excited to show Steven his mother's secret armory, boasting about how Rose kept it hidden from everybody except for her.
Welcome to Rose's secret armory.
Whoa. I've been here before.
What?
She's stunned to see that Steven might know more about how to use this place than her, and is shocked to find out that Lion in fact belonged to Rose, something she never knew about, causing her whole worldview to shatter, to know that Rose kept secrets from her too, with her running away not even being able to face Steven. It's a really heartbreaking moment, especially because Steven hasn't even really done anything wrong or know how to console her. Because he's the reason Rose isn't around anymore. Which leads to, in my opinion, the best interaction of the whole series and cements this as my favorite of the entire show.
Everything I ever did,
I did for her. Now she's gone, but I'm still here. Sometimes, I wonder if she can see me through your eyes. What would she think of me now?
Well, I think you're pretty great.
The lighting, the tone, the looser expressions, the lack of any real music until the end, and when it comes in, it's this really somber but grandiose, bittersweet tune. And when they're riding off in the end, Pearl's just blankly looking forward, and then down at Steven. It's this truly amazing setup and payoff that I don't think the series has ever come close to even matching since. It's why I don't mind the approach they have of everything in the show needing to be from Steven's point of view. A complaint that started popping up more and more as the series went on is how we don't see anything that Steven doesn't see. Aside from a few gags or a line or two before and after he walks into frame, but this is Steven's universe, so we as the audience only ever follow him around. And while later on it does become a bit tedious, with the epilogue series devoting an entire episode to this criticism, where Steven can't comprehend events happening without him being present, I at least think that in Season 1, it works well for the narrative they're building. You as the audience know as much about the gems as Steven, that being fuck all. So as the season does progress, it's almost like we're learning alongside the kid. Everything new for us is new for him too. And with Lapis warning him not to trust any of them, it only adds to the suspicion. Because yeah, we really don't know a lot about them beyond what little info they decide to let Steven in on. So it makes it all the more effective when Steven does manage to learn a bit, especially without their knowledge. Like when he overhears them talking about what's really going on. That they're scared. Lapis has gone back to Homeworld, and as we learn in episode 36, more gems are starting to come to Earth, and none of them really know why. This is when we're introduced to Peridot, but she doesn't really play much of a role in Season 1, and a lot of her character quirks aren't yet in place, but I think not showing that much does a better job of making her come off as threatening. You know, compared to the epic, wholesome, small, angry girl that she's later defined to be. Now, none of this is to say that the series is completely serialized from this point on. A majority of these are still standalone episodes, but it's never as if they forget what's going on. For example, when following Steven around doing this tiny nonsense, we'll still see the gems pass by trying to figure out what to do with these little homeworld contraptions coming down, or talking about what to do about Peridot. Even in minor ways, which I like a lot. For example, you notice that over the course of the season, Steven is reading a bunch of books and discussing them with Connie. I thought it was weird to focus on it at first until they remind you that way back in a previous episode, there's a joke where Steven disobeys the gems and gets grounded from TV, so of course he'd start reading more. Super small detail, but it's all a very clever way to keep continuity while not having every episode be a major story event. And it's not perfect, you know, when it works, and when it doesn't. Like, remember when Steven went inside Lion's Mane and found the VHS tape? Well, it takes him like 10 episodes after that to actually bother pulling out the scabbard in there for the Pearl episode, just because the plot demanded it. But if this was such a big deal to either Steven or Pearl, you think she'd be like, fucking hell, pull everything out, I want to see what's in there. Because, as we later find out in Season 3, one of the things in there is another crystal gem. I don't think we even find out what a lot of this stuff is by the end of the show, so hey, that's fun. But generally, I think the season's strongest aspect with its story isn't the homeworld stuff, it isn't even the crystal gem stuff and their backstories. Instead, I think the strongest aspect of Season 1 that puts it above all the others in my mind is that it's the only season of the entire show to fully flesh out and realize the character arc they set up. With this being the longest season by double the episodes, there's so much room to breathe, whereas the show would later feel as if it's speeding along, desperately trying to get to the conclusion in fear of cancellation. True story, watch my short. Season 1, on the other hand, takes this super slow approach to Steven's character, where things will be picked up and dropped off and revisited again whenever natural. Before the Lapis stuff, we have an episode dedicated to Steven learning how to replicate Rose's healing tears or else Amethyst will die. And while he doesn't exceed in the way expected, he does later find out by the end of it that he has healing spit, which comes into play later in Ocean Gem, when he heals Lapis so she'll return the ocean and go back home. Not only is that a great callback, but they go even further with it to build upon Steven's training. He can't just do it on command now, well done. It's something that he still has to be able to work towards. In the very next episode, we see Steven's dad having a broken leg over the events of Ocean Gem, and despite Steven being able to do it just fine with Lapis, he can't seem to heal his dad's leg. Which is terrible because there's this massive geode that's on the brink of breaking, which would cause catastrophic events to unfold across the world. But as we later find out, Greg's leg is fine. Steven did heal it first try, but Greg lied about it so he would be able to spend more time with his son, which he's getting to do less and less the more he goes on these gem adventures. But that innocent goal is undermined by the fact that it got in Steven's head. He really can't use his healing powers anymore. It's an excellent way of taking your generic episode about someone lying about an injury, a plot they've literally done already this season, a plot most would probably cry about being filler, and makes it important by still having the events of it contribute to the overall theme of the season, of Steven having to learn how to control his powers and grow. And while they do eventually fix the problem through other means, his healing powers don't come back. He once again has to learn how to get that confidence back. This culminates in probably my second favorite episode of the entire series, The Test, where the gems accidentally reveal to Steven that all the way back in episode 3, when he messed up one of the missions through his usual goofy Steven self, that it didn't matter as they were merely using it as a test to see if he was ready to go on missions. A test which he failed. And so despite being so long ago and not being really relevant anymore, Steven begs the gems to give him a new test. A hard one. I love Pearl's line saying that he doesn't really need it anymore, that he's come so far, but he still wants it anyway. Showing that the idea of him failing is so overbearing that he can't even realize that he's since then exceeded what any test would require from him. So we see him go through a dungeon comprised of 3 rooms, and at the very end where it seems like Steven is gonna fail and get crushed, he finds out the most troubling news of all. It was rigged. The gems never put him in any real danger and that there was no way for him to lose. From Steven's point of view, this only adds to his belief that the gems don't think he's capable, that he's still just a kid and they can't rely on him. And just when he's about to blow up and yell at them for tricking him, he overhears this.
The point is that he's come so far. He can make Rose's bubble, and he's pulled out Rose's shield twice. We have to give him another success. He can't lose his confidence like that again.
We're bad at this.
What?
He realizes that not only did they do this for his own mental benefit, to stop focusing on his past failures, but in a way that the gems are also doing this for themselves. They're broken without their leader and don't know what to do, and so Steven lies. He doesn't admit that he knew it was fake for their confidence. He'll let them have a small but meaningful victory in a time where everything else is uncertain. One of the best moments in the whole show in my opinion, and it's contrasted greatly against how defiant Steven starts becoming in this second half, with him being much more willing to argue and talk back to the gems when he knows he's in the right.
Yes, Steven feels much better now.
I'm a little tired of you guys telling me how I feel.
This all pays off by the end of the season, where Lapis sends a message down to Earth warning them that the homeworld gems are coming, with Steven quite literally being stuck between the 2 different settings of the show, the gem stuff and the tiny stuff. The penultimate episode's focusing on him trying to get the town ready for evacuation, teaching them to band together in times of crisis, giving somewhat of a neat little finale to the tiny episodes. And the next showing these homeworld gems coming down to Beach City inside a giant floating hand, revealing Peridot once again, with Lapis and newcomer Jasper, whose role is to kill all of the crystal gems. They try to use the laser light cannons from the second episode on it, which I think was a great touch to show how powerful Homeworld is. In that one, just a single cannon was able to destroy the threat of that episode. Yet here, 4 of them don't even put a dent on Homeworld. With the town all having to evacuate, that means Steven and his dad too. Which pisses him off as it still shows they don't see him as an equal, someone who could be an asset to the team. And I like that they give Greg a little moment here too, to express how he doesn't really want Steven doing all this stuff if it can mean he loses his son. But eventually, he trusts him enough to let him go back and help. Where once again the gems tell him to get out, resulting in what I believe to be the true payoff to the season.
Steven, get out of here!
No! I'm a crystal gem too!
The season never really had a focus on Garnet at all. And while I do like the actual finale and the song she sings and everything, I just never felt her moment had the same impact this does. The entire season has slowly been showing Steven resenting how the gems treat him like a child, and his inability to learn how to use his powers. So him saving them from a shattering blast with the use of his shield always comes off to me like the culmination of all that stuff. But yeah, no, the real finale has them up on the ship and it's revealed Garnet is actually a fusion of 2 other gems, which is a neat reveal, and it explains why she has 2 gems on her temple door and was so ecstatic when Steven and Connie fused together. But I love the ending, the calm after the storm. We're having this giant space-traveling life-or-death adventure, and watching Lapis and Jasper fuse only for the former to drag her into the ocean, Connie gives Steven a call asking what happened, once again dragging him back down to reality, that this is going to be the status quo from now on. Ending the season on the implication that the next is going to be much grander in scale. They didn't really live up to that, but hey, that's not what this is about. Overall, I just think that Season 1 of Steven Universe is without a doubt the most well-rounded season of the show, and I definitely don't agree with a lot of the community's assessment that a majority of it should be skipped. While it's certainly not perfect, me focusing on all the story moments neglects how many episodes truly are just kind of bad in my opinion, like Shirt Club or Winter Forecast or Fusion Cuisine. Most of the rest of the season is great, sometimes amazing. I hate this stigma we currently have around episodic cartoons, this strange belief that if something doesn't have an ongoing story then it's without merit. Current animation fans, I feel, have become way too obsessed with shows that slowly drip feed you bits of history over the course of 3 seasons, whether or not said lore is even any good. Sometimes, a bit of episodic fun is needed, and I think Steven Universe's first season does an excellent job at balancing both. I briefly want to cover some of the other aspects of the series that's talked about a lot online, the main, of course, being the animation. Steven Universe has met with a lot of complaints over its approach to the character models, that being the animators are directed to follow the storyboards as closely as possible, with said storyboard artists not being restricted to staying super on model. Basically, if it looks like the character, then it is the character. And while, yeah, it does become a bit distracting at times, especially during early Season 1, Jesus, they could not agree on how big to make Pearl's fucking face.
Some of us are trying to protect humanity. Where were you?
Generally, I don't find it to be that much of an issue, but I love how expressive the characters can be, and whatever brush they use for the line art looks amazing, it's super clean. Also, generally, these more off-model scenes aren't relevant when talking about the more serious moments of the story. Like, sure, there are a few pretty bad cherry-picked examples where it looks pretty egregious, but I don't think there was ever a moment in the show where I was meant to take something seriously, but couldn't because of the visuals. The music and backgrounds add to this greatly. I love the pastel colors of Beach City that give it this laid-back vibe. You can tell the artists had a very specific place in mind that they were trying to replicate with this location, and it contrasts really well against the more dark and saturated colors used for the gem stuff. And this score is wonderful. I'm not a super big fan of how much chiptune is used, although that may simply be a result of how overdone it is now. But I also think it's because when they do use actual instruments, it works so well at adding such a theatrical feeling to the scenes they're used in. It's really one of the best scores, I think, from any cartoon in recent times. And with all this, I just ended the season wondering, why is this so hated? And then I realized that maybe it isn't really Season 1's fault. Well, I'm sure there are folks out there who just don't like this show because they don't like it, and that's fine, honestly, I get why you'd not like this. But maybe some of this hate comes from what the show became after all of this. Steven Universe fans don't like how much it flip-flops between the gem stuff they want to see and the town stuff they deem as filler. And Steven Universe haters don't like how it set the groundwork for the series to lean heavily into what they began setting up here in the future. Whatever the reason may be, all I can really say is, I like it. I like it a lot. And I'm happy to have been able to revisit this after so long. I probably would have went on making fun of the show, and honestly, maybe still will, it's very easy to do. But deep down, I'll always have a level of appreciation for Steven Universe. And maybe in the future I'll sit down and talk about the rest of the series at some point, who knows.